How to ask the right question. In the spring of 2019, a product team at a mid-sized software company spent 6 weeks building a feature that let users customize the color scheme of their dashboard. The designers worked late. The engineers argued about the right implementation. The project manager ran weekly stand-ups, tracked velocity, and marked tickets green. When the feature shipped, fewer than 2% of users ever touched it. The feature sat there, technically sound and functionally ignored. Nobody had asked the wrong question in an obvious way. Nobody had been negligent or lazy. What happened was quieter and more common. Nobody had stopped to ask the right one. The question driving the project had been, how do we let users personalize their experience? A reasonable question on its surface. A better question, asked earlier, would have been, what makes users feel like this product doesn't belong to them? Those are not the same question. The first generates a feature. The second might have generated a conversation about onboarding, or default settings, or the copy on the welcome screen. The team never found out, because 6 weeks had already been spent. This book is about the gap between those two questions. What this book is not a book about communication. It will not teach you to make eye contact, mirror body language, or end sentences with, does that make sense? It is not a negotiation manual, a therapy workbook, or a guide to becoming a more likable person in meetings. There are good books for all of those things. This is not one of them. This is also not a book about curiosity as a personality trait. You have probably read or heard advice that boils down to just be more curious, as though the capacity for good questions is something you either have or you don't, like perfect pitch or a fast metabolism. That framing is not only unhelpful, it's wrong. Asking better questions is a learnable skill, and like most learnable skills, it has a structure underneath it that you can understand and practice. The goal of this book is to give you that structure. What this book is a system. Specifically, it is a set of lenses, habits, and checkpoints that help you generate the questions that unlock real answers, not more information, but better decisions. The emphasis on system is deliberate. Systems are repeatable. They work even when you're tired, even in a meeting that's running long, even when the person across the table is confident and senior and pushing for a fast answer. A system doesn't require you to be at your best. It works on an ordinary Tuesday. At the core of the system are 3 mental models introduced early in Part 1, and they're worth previewing now. The first is what this book calls the breaks. Check. Before you ask anything, you ask what breaks if your current assumption is wrong. What are the actual stakes? The second is the reversibility radar, a simple framework for distinguishing decisions that are hard to walk back, type 1, from those that are easy to undo, type 2. One demands slow, careful questioning. The other doesn't. The third is the 5 whys, the classic tool for drilling past the surface of a problem by asking why 5 times in sequence. It sounds almost too simple. It is also genuinely corrective, for reasons the science of cognition helps explain. These are not tips. They are tools with a specific logic behind them. The book explains that logic, because when you understand why a tool works, you can adapt it rather than just apply it mechanically. How the book is structured. Part 1, Science, covers how the brain actually generates questions and why it so reliably generates the wrong ones first. It introduces the research on framing effects, confirmation bias, and the social pressures that make meetings a particularly poor environment for asking anything genuinely useful. Understanding the failure modes is not depressing. It is clarifying. Part 2, Craft, moves into the practical work of constructing better questions. It covers how to target an assumption rather than gather more data, how to know when you have enough information to decide, and how to ask harder questions in situations where the social stakes feel high. Part 3, Practice, applies the system across different contexts, product and feature development, personal decisions, relationships, and systems design. The frameworks don't change between domains. What changes is what's at stake and what assumptions tend to hide in plain sight. A note before you start: if you have ever left a meeting and had the sinking feeling that nobody in the room asked the question that actually mattered, you already understand, intuitively, what this book is about. You have felt the gap between the questions that got asked and the one that would have changed everything.
That feeling is not a flaw in your self-awareness. It is a signal.
This book is about learning to act on that signal before the meeting ends, before the 6 weeks are gone, before the feature ships to 2% engagement.
The good news is genuine. Asking better questions is not a gift some people are born with. It is a practice, and you can start today. What a right question actually is here is something that will probably surprise you. Asking more questions does not reliably produce better outcomes. In a series of studies published by Allison Wood Brooks and Leslie John at Harvard Business School, researchers found that people who asked more questions in conversations were not consistently better at gathering useful information, building rapport, or making good decisions. What mattered was not the quantity of questions but their type, specifically, whether a question was designed to confirm what the asker already suspected or to genuinely test it. The difference between those two orientations is, in miniature, the difference between a question that wastes time and one that changes everything. This finding cuts against almost everything you've been told about curiosity and inquiry.
The popular advice ask more, listen harder, stay curious is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete to the point of being misleading.
More questions can produce more noise just as easily as more signal. A person who asks 12 questions in a meeting can leave knowing less about what matters than someone who asked one.
The issue is not frequency. The issue is whether the question was aimed at the right thing.
So what is the right thing?
That is what this chapter is about. The wrong definition we all start with. Most people, if you ask them what a good question looks like, will describe something open-ended. Not yes or no but expansive, something that invites reflection, that gives the other person room to speak.
Tell me more about what you mean rather than did you mean X? This is the standard communication workshop definition, and it captures something real. Closed questions can shut down thinking.
But open-endedness is not the defining property of a right question.
It is at best a secondary feature. Others will say a good question is one that comes from a place of genuine curiosity, as opposed to performance. This is also true and also insufficient.
You can be genuinely curious about the wrong thing. You can invest enormous sincere interest in a question that has no useful answer, a question whose answer wouldn't change what you do next, no matter what it was.
Neither of these definitions gives you a working tool.
Knowing that a question should be open or sincere doesn't help you in the moment when you're staring at a blank page, or sitting across from a colleague who has just proposed a 6-month project, or trying to understand why your relationship keeps having the same argument. What you need is a definition precise enough to act on. A working definition. A right question does 3 things.
It targets an assumption. It has a useful answer. And the answer changes what you do next. These 3 properties form an anatomy.
Pull any one of them out and the question degrades into something that either gathers noise, confirms what you already believe, or generates insight that goes nowhere.
All 3 together, and you have a question worth asking. Each one deserves unpacking.
It targets an assumption. Every situation that calls for a question is built on a foundation of assumptions. Most of those assumptions are invisible, not because they're being hidden, but because they haven't been examined. They're the things everyone in the room has silently agreed are true without ever actually agreeing on them. In the product team scenario from the introduction, the invisible assumption was that the user problem was one of personalization. That assumption had never been tested. It had accumulated through a series of small conversations, a few user complaints about the look and feel, and a product manager who had read something about customization in a competitor app. By the time the team was writing tickets and scheduling stand-ups, the assumption felt like a fact.
It wasn't.
A right question goes after assumptions. Not all assumptions. There are always more assumptions in a situation than you have time to examine, and chasing all of them is a form of paralysis. That masquerades as rigor.
The useful discipline is to identify which assumptions are load-bearing. Which ones, if wrong, would change everything? This is the brakes.
Check mentioned in the introduction. Before you commit to a line of inquiry, you ask what breaks if you're wrong about the thing you're taking for granted.
Load-bearing assumptions are typically the ones that are both unexamined and consequential. Users want more customization is load-bearing.
Our database can handle this query might be load-bearing. The team understands the goal the same way is almost always load-bearing and almost always unchecked.
The physicist Richard Feynman had a habit of demanding that any problem be restated in terms of what you actually know versus what you're assuming. He was difficult about it in a way that irritated colleagues and eventually produced Nobel Prize-winning insights. The irritating part and the insight part were not separate. They were the same thing. He was asking questions that targeted assumptions, which meant he was asking questions that his colleagues would rather have treated as settled. You don't have to be Feynman. But you do have to be willing to make the assumptions visible before you start asking questions on top of them. It has a useful answer. This sounds obvious until you start paying attention to how many questions you ask and how many others ask that have no useful answer. A useful answer is not the same as an interesting answer, a true answer, or even a satisfying answer. A useful answer is one that gives you something to act on, decide, or discard. Why did this project fail is often not a useful question, for the same reason that what is the meaning of life is not useful. The answer space is enormous, the question invites post hoc rationalization, and nothing you find will clearly point to a next action. What would we need to believe for this approach to work is a more useful question. So what was the one thing we assumed that we never checked? Those are answerable in a way that connects directly to decision and action. Don Norman, the cognitive scientist and design thinker whose work on human-centered design reshaped how we think about everything from doorknobs to software, introduced the concept of affordances, the properties of an object or environment that signal what actions are possible. A chair affords sitting. A handle affords pulling. Good design, Norman argued, makes affordances visible. Poor design hides them or makes them misleading. The classic example is a door with a handle that you're supposed to push. The handle affords pulling. The correct action is pushing. The design is lying to you. Questions work the same way. A question has an affordance, it invites a particular kind of thinking. How long will this take affords an estimate. What would we have to cut to deliver this in 2 weeks affords a prioritization conversation. These are not the same question, and they do not produce the same answer, and the difference between those two answers is the difference between a schedule and a decision. Ryan Singer, the designer and product strategist behind Basecamp's shape-up methodology, makes a version of this point sharply, asking how long will it take, treat scope as fixed, when scope is almost never actually fixed. It affords an estimation exercise. What you usually need is an appetite conversation. How much time and energy are we willing to spend on this problem? That question affords something genuinely useful. A right question has an affordance that points toward a real answer. When you construct a question, it's worth asking yourself, what kind of answer does this invite, and is that the kind of answer I actually need? It changes what you do next. The third property is the one most often missing. A question can target an assumption and have a useful answer and still be a waste of time if the answer doesn't actually change your behavior. This sounds impossible. If you got a useful answer, how could it not change anything? But it happens constantly. It happens when the question is asked after the decision has effectively already been made. It happens when the question is asked for social reasons, to signal thoroughness, to appear open-minded, to make someone feel heard without being willing to change course. It happens in retrospectives where you diagnose what went wrong and then proceed to make the same structural decisions the following quarter. A right question is asked at the point where the answer can still matter. This is partly about timing and partly about honesty. The timing question is whether you're asking early enough in a process for the answer to actually redirect it. The honesty question is whether you're genuinely willing to change course if the answer is not what you expected or hoped. This is where the reversibility radar becomes useful as a companion tool. Not every decision needs the same depth of questioning. A Type 2 decision, one that's easy to reverse, does not require the same careful questioning as a Type 1 decision. If you're choosing a color for a prototype that 3 people will see once, you don't need to surface every assumption and demand a useful answer. If you're choosing an architecture that will take 2 years to migrate away from, you do. The reversibility radar tells you how much rigor to apply. Right questions are most critical where reversibility is lowest. When you ask a right question at the right time, with genuine willingness to follow the answer, decisions sharpen. Plans change. Sometimes projects stop. All of those outcomes are good, including the last one.
A project that stops because the right question was asked early is infinitely cheaper than a project that ships because nobody ever asked it. The hollow advice problem. It's worth spending a moment on why the usual advice, be curious, ask more, stay open, fails as a practical tool, because understanding why it fails helps clarify what you actually need. Be curious is a disposition, not a skill. Dispositions are useful as background conditions. If you are chronically incurious, you will probably not ask many questions at all, and that is a problem. But among people who are broadly curious and engaged, the limiting factor is not curiosity. It is technique. Telling a curious person to be more curious is like telling a motivated runner to be more motivated. The advice does not address the actual constraint. Ask more questions fails for the reason the Harvard research illuminates: volume is not the variable that matters. More questions can mean more noise, more distraction, more time spent on things that don't change the outcome. In contexts where time is limited, a conversation, a meeting, a relationship where the other person only has so much patience, asking more questions indiscriminately is actively counterproductive. You're spending a finite resource on low-value outputs. Stay open is perhaps the most seductive of the hollow instructions, because it sounds like wisdom and sometimes is. But staying open as practiced often means staying undecided, which is its own kind of failure. The goal is not to remain permanently open, the goal is to close questions at the right time, with the right information. Staying open past that point is not intellectual humility. It is procrastination with better branding. What replaces this advice is not more advice. It is a structural approach. Identify the assumption you're not examining, construct a question that has a useful answer, and ask it at a point where the answer can still change something. That's the system. Everything else in this book is scaffolding around that core. Questions as tools, not performances. There is a social dimension to questions that is worth naming directly, because it creates a persistent pressure toward the wrong kind. In most group contexts, meetings, presentations, conversations with senior people, questions function partly as signals. Asking a question communicates something about who you are, that you're engaged, thoughtful, thorough, intellectually serious. This social function is real and not entirely bad. Questions as performance create at least some incentive to engage. The problem is when the performance function overwhelms the tool function. When you ask a question primarily to signal engagement rather than to get an answer you'll use, you are not asking a right question. You are asking a social question. Social questions are not worthless. Maintaining trust and signaling investment in a conversation matters, but they should not be confused with the questions that do actual cognitive work. The pressure towards social questions is especially strong in hierarchical environments. When you are newer, less senior, or uncertain of your status, asking a question that challenges a core assumption can feel dangerous. What if you're wrong? What if the assumption is correct and you look naive for questioning it? What if the person who built the assumption gets defensive and it creates conflict? These are real concerns, not irrational fears. The social stakes of questioning can be genuine. This is part of why better questioning is not just a cognitive skill but also, in some contexts, a mild form of courage. You have to be willing to ask the question that surfaces the real constraint, even when the social pressure is to ask something safer and more comfortable. The techniques in part 2 of this book are partly about making that easier, structuring questions so they feel collaborative rather than adversarial, so they open conversations rather than shut them down. But the structural techniques only work if you're willing to use them. The willingness is yours to develop. Practical reflection. This reflection is designed to be done with a specific, recent question in mind, something you asked in the last week, in any context, a meeting, a conversation, a decision you were working through alone. 1. Write down the question as you actually asked it, in as close to the original words as possible. 2. Ask yourself, what assumption was this question aimed at? If it wasn't aimed at any assumption, what was it aimed at? 3. Ask yourself, did this question have a useful answer, one that pointed toward a decision or action? Or did it invite a broad, exploratory answer with no clear connection to what happens next? 4. Ask yourself, did the answer to this question change anything you did? If so, what? If not, why not? Was it the wrong time, the wrong question, or were you not actually willing to change course? 5. Now ask, what would the right question have been?
What assumption, if surfaced earlier, would have produced a more useful answer at a point where it could still have changed the outcome? You don't have to do anything with the answer to step 5 right now. Just sit with the gap between the question you asked and the one you could have asked. That gap is exactly what this book is about closing. Why your brain asks wrong questions. Your brain was not designed for accuracy. It was designed for survival, which sounds like the same thing until you realize how often they conflict. Survival favors speed. Accuracy often requires slowness. Survival rewards pattern matching from incomplete data. Accuracy demands that you check whether the pattern actually fits. For hundreds of thousands of years, the faster you could answer is that a predator, the better your odds. Getting the answer exactly right mattered less than getting it fast and erring toward threat. A brain that occasionally misclassified a shadow as a lion was fine. A brain that took 30 seconds to carefully evaluate the evidence was lunch. The legacy of that history sits inside you right now, generating questions. And the questions it generates are fast, pattern-matched, and frequently wrong, not wrong in the sense of factually incorrect, but wrong in the sense of aimed at the wrong thing. They confirm rather than test. They accept the frame they were given rather than questioning it. They stop at the first explanation that feels plausible rather than drilling to the root. Understanding why this happens is not an exercise in self-blame. It is a diagnostic, and diagnostics are useful precisely because they tell you where to intervene. The two systems and the one that asks questions first. Daniel Kahneman's work on human cognition, most accessibly summarized in his book Thinking, Fast and Slow, identifies two modes of mental processing that he calls System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, automatic, and associative. It runs continuously in the background, generating impressions, feelings, and intuitions without effort. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and effortful. It handles complex calculation, careful reasoning, and anything that requires sustained attention. You've experienced both, the way you immediately recognize a face versus the way you consciously work through a long division problem. The important thing about this framework, for our purposes, is not which system is better. Both are necessary. The important thing is which system asks questions first. System 1 does. Always. System 1 sees a situation, pattern matches to something it's seen before, generates an immediate interpretation, and hands that interpretation to your consciousness as though it were a fact. Your conscious mind, the part that could, in theory, ask a careful and rigorous question, is already working with a framed version of reality by the time it gets involved. It's not getting the raw situation. It's getting System 1's annotated summary. This means that the question you naturally ask about any situation is not a neutral question. It's the question that follows from System 1's interpretation of what's happening. And that interpretation was generated in milliseconds, based on pattern matching, without any explicit weighing of evidence. The question feels like your question. It's actually the question System 1 handed you. The experience of this is subtle. You don't feel hijacked. You feel like you're thinking. And you are just about a version of the situation that may already be wrong. Confirmation bias. Why you ask what you already know. The answer to confirmation bias is probably the most documented cognitive bias in psychology. The core finding, replicated in study after study since Peter Wayson's original 2-4-6 task experiments in the 1960s, is that people reliably seek information that confirms their existing beliefs and avoid or discount information that challenges them. But there is a more specific and more useful way to understand confirmation bias as it relates to questions. It doesn't just affect what information you look for, it affects what questions occur to you in the first place. Wayson's original experiment is still instructive. He gave participants three numbers, 2, 4, 6, and told them that the sequence followed a rule. Their job was to discover the rule by proposing other three-number sequences. The experimenter would say whether each proposed sequence followed the rule. The actual rule was simple: any three numbers in ascending order. Most participants immediately assumed the rule was even numbers or numbers increasing by 2. And then they generated sequences that confirmed that hypothesis. They proposed 4, 6, 8. Then 8, 10, 12. The experimenter kept saying yes. They became more confident. Then they announced their wrong rule. Almost no one thought to test a disconfirming sequence.
Almost no one proposed 1, 2, 3, which would also have gotten a yes and blown up the even numbers hypothesis. The confirming questions felt natural. The disconfirming question was, to most participants, nearly unthinkable. Not because they were intellectually limited, but because that's how the brain works. System 1 hands you a hypothesis, and you test it by looking for yes. In the context of product development, this plays out in a particular way that Ryan Singer has described with characteristic directness in Shape Up. When a team enters a feature conversation with a hypothesis, users need more customization. The questions that naturally follow are confirming ones. How many users have requested this? Confirming. What would the interface look like? Confirming. How do we scope this for the next cycle? Confirming. Nobody asks, what would it mean if we're wrong about the user need? That's the disconfirming question. It almost never gets asked, because it doesn't feel like the next natural step in the conversation. It feels like obstruction. But it is the only question that could save the team 6 weeks. The framing effect. Why the cage determines the question. The framing effect is a close cousin of confirmation bias, but it operates at a more fundamental level. Rather than affecting how you evaluate information, framing affects what information you perceive as relevant in the first place. The way a situation is presented, the words used, the order of information, the emotional valence of the setup, determines which questions even occur to you. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman's classic experiment on the Asian disease problem demonstrated this cleanly. Participants were told that an unusual disease was expected to kill 600 people and were asked to choose between 2 response programs. One group received the options framed in terms of lives saved. Program A saves 200 people, Program B has a 1/3 chance of saving 600 people and a 2/3 chance of saving nobody. Another group received the same options framed in terms of lives lost. Program A means 400 people will die, Program B has a 1/3 chance that nobody will die and a 2/3 chance that 600 will die. The mathematical outcomes were identical. The choice patterns were completely different. Framing changed what felt like the right answer. What has received less attention is the way framing affects what questions people think to ask. When the disease problem was presented in terms of lives saved, participants asked questions about certainty versus risk in the context of gain. When it was presented in terms of lives lost, they asked questions about how to minimize downside. The underlying decision was the same. The questions it generated were not. The frame didn't just change the answer, it changed the question space. This matters enormously in practical contexts. When your manager describes a project as an opportunity to expand our market presence, the questions that naturally follow are about how to pursue the opportunity. When the same project is described as a response to the competitor who just launched in our space, the questions that follow are about threat mitigation. The project hasn't changed. The frame has. And the questions the frame generates will produce different information, different plans, and different outcomes. Don Norman's work on mental models is relevant here. Norman argues that people operate not on the world itself but on their mental model of the world, their internal representation of how things work. The gap between the mental model and reality is the source of most design errors. A person who believes a push door should have a handle is operating on an incorrect mental model, and no amount of intelligence or effort will help them pull less hard. The door has to change, or the mental model has to change. The frame of a problem is a mental model. When someone presents you with a problem in a particular frame, we need to decide between these 2 options. They are handing you a mental model of the situation. That mental model has already ruled out a large number of questions. Are either of these options the right approach, is no longer a question that fits the frame. Is this actually the problem we should be solving, has been pre-answered by the way the situation was presented. The questions that feel natural inside the frame are the questions the frame permits. The questions that matter are often the ones that question the frame itself. Why meetings make everything worse. Understanding individual cognitive biases is useful, but it doesn't fully explain why the quality of questioning tends to degrade specifically in group settings, in meetings, presentations, and collaborative decision-making contexts. Something additional happens in groups that makes the wrong questions feel even more natural and the right questions feel even more dangerous. The social psychologist Elliot Aronson, among others, has documented the way group settings activate concerns about status and belonging that override other cognitive goals. When you're in a meeting, you are not just trying to solve a problem. You are simultaneously managing impressions, maintaining relationships, signaling your value to the group, and navigating a real-time social situation with incomplete information about what the other people in the room want and believe. These social goals are not trivial. They are real and important. Humans are social animals, and the consequences of social exclusion or status loss are not imaginary. Your brain takes them seriously. The result is a predictable distortion in what questions get asked. Questions that challenge fundamental assumptions are socially risky. They imply that the person who built the assumption was wrong. They can be read as hostile, obstructionist, or naive, depending on who's in the room and what the political dynamics are. Questions that confirm the frame and move the conversation forward, how do we execute this, rather than should we do this at all, are socially safe. They signal alignment. They keep the meeting moving. They make everyone feel like progress is happening. This is not hypocrisy. The people who ask confirming questions in meetings are not consciously trading truth for social safety. The question that confirms the frame simply feels like the more natural question. The social risk of the challenging question is processed by System 1 before it ever reaches conscious deliberation. The right question never quite surfaces, because the brain has already assessed the social cost and quietly filed it away. The consequence is that the most important questions in any organization are systematically underasked. They are underasked not because nobody is smart enough to think of them, but because the social environment of group settings actively suppresses them. The person who would ask "why are we building this at all?" in a one-on-one conversation will ask "what's the timeline?" in a meeting with 12 people and a senior VP at the table. Singer's Shape-Up framework addresses this in a structural way. The shaping process he describes deliberately happens before anything goes to the wider team, before the meeting, before the ticket, before the presentation. Shaping is the process of defining a problem, identifying the constraints, and scoping the appetite privately, so that by the time a proposal reaches the group, the hard questions have already been asked. The group meeting is not where fundamental assumptions get interrogated, it's where a shaped proposal gets evaluated. This works in part because it removes the assumption questioning from the social setting where it's hardest to do. The "how long will it take?" trap. There is one question that appears in almost every team context and almost never produces useful information: how long will it take? Singer is direct about why this question is almost always wrong. It treats scope as a constant and time as a variable. In reality, scope is almost always negotiable, and the question that would actually be useful is some version of "what can we do in the time we're willing to spend?" The trap is not just that the question produces inaccurate answers, though it does, reliably and systematically, because software estimation is notoriously difficult and human beings are congenitally optimistic about effort. The deeper trap is that asking "how long will it take?" forecloses the more important conversation about whether the problem is worth the time at all, and whether the proposed solution is actually the right solution to the problem. How long will it take is a System 1 question. It feels like the practical, grounded, responsible question to ask. It sounds like you're being realistic. What it actually does is accept the frame: the feature exists, it has a fixed shape, the only variable is duration, and ask a measurement question within that frame. The frame itself is unquestioned. The assumption that the feature is conceived as the right response to the user's problem is unquestioned. The assumption that the team's current understanding of the user's problem is correct is unquestioned. The question that targets the load-bearing assumption is, what problem does this solve, and what's the cheapest way to know whether we're solving the right one? That question is slower, more uncomfortable, and far more useful. It also almost never gets asked, because "how long will it take?" is sitting right there, ready to be asked, and it feels like the meeting can't proceed until someone asks it. 5 Whys, disrupting the default stopping point. The 5 Whys technique was developed by Sakichi Toyoda at Toyota in the early 20th century and formalized as part of the Toyota production system. The method is simple: when you encounter a problem, ask why it happened. Then ask why that happened.
Then ask why that happened. Do this 5 times, and you will typically reach the root cause, not the symptom, not the proximate cause, but the systemic condition that made the failure possible. The reason this technique works is not mystical. It is cognitive. Your brain has a default stopping point when looking for causes. That stopping point is the first plausible explanation, the explanation that pattern matches to something familiar, that fits the frame, that system 1 can accept without discomfort. For most problems, the first plausible explanation is not the root cause. It is a symptom, or approximate cause, or an artifact of how the problem was framed. The first why gets you there quickly. The subsequent whys force you past the stopping point. Consider a simple example. A team's deployment pipeline is taking 4 hours when it should take 40 minutes. Why? Because the test suite is running slowly. Why? Because the test suite includes integration tests that weren't there 6 months ago. Why? Because the lead engineer added them after a production incident. Why? Because there was no monitoring in place to catch that category of error before production. Why? Because the team's monitoring setup was designed for the original architecture and was never updated when the architecture changed. Now you have a root cause, an architectural change without corresponding investment in observability. The first answer, slow tests, points toward a different solution than the root cause does. The 5 whys disrupts the brain's default stopping point by making it socially and procedurally awkward to stop at the first answer. If you're in a context where everyone has agreed to ask why 5 times, stopping at the first why requires actively breaking the protocol. The protocol creates a modest structural pressure to continue past the comfortable answer. That modest pressure is often enough. What the 5 whys cannot do, and this is important, is correct for a bad initial framing. If the first why is asked about the wrong symptom, the subsequent whys will still drill to the root of the wrong problem. The 5 whys works downstream of the breaks? Check, not instead of it. You still need to identify the load-bearing assumption before you start drilling. Once you have, the 5 whys gives you a reliable tool for reaching its root. The question you didn't ask: there is a particular kind of regret that comes from realizing, after the fact, that there was an obvious question you didn't ask and that asking it would have changed everything. This regret has a slightly different quality from ordinary regret. It's not that you made the wrong decision, it's that you didn't even have the right information to make the decision with. The missing question wasn't a casualty of bad judgment. It was a casualty of the cognitive and social processes described in this chapter. System 1 handed you a framed version of the situation. Confirmation bias pushed you toward questions that confirmed the frame. The social dynamics of the meeting made challenging questions feel risky, and the default stopping point of causal reasoning kept you at the symptom rather than the root. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the regret. But it does something more useful: it gives you a target. You now know where the failure typically happens, which means you know where to intervene. Before the next decision, you can ask what load-bearing assumptions haven't been examined. Before the next meeting, you can ask yourself what question you'd be too uncomfortable to ask in the room and then ask it anyway. Before you accept the first explanation for why something went wrong, you can ask why 4 more times. The right questions are not usually hidden. They are suppressed by speed, by framing, by social risk, by the brain's preference for fast pattern matching over careful examination. The chapters that follow are about the specific techniques for unsuppressing them, how to construct the question that targets the assumption, how to ask it in a way that opens conversation rather than shutting it down, and how to do all of this in the contexts where it matters most. Practical reflection: think about a significant decision you made in the last 3 to 6 months, something with real stakes, in work or in life. It does not have to be a decision that went badly. It just has to be consequential. 1. Write down the decision as you made it. What were the options you considered? What information did you have? 2. Now write down the questions you asked before making the decision. What were you trying to find out? Who did you ask? 3. Ask yourself, what was the frame you were operating inside? Who gave you that frame, and did you ever question it? 4. Ask yourself, what was the most important assumption you did not examine? What would you need to have believed for this assumption to turn out to be wrong?
5. Apply the 5 whys backward. Take the outcome of your decision and ask why 5 times in the direction of root cause. Not to assign blame, but to find the systemic condition that shaped the decision before you even started asking questions.
6. Finally, what was the question you didn't ask?
Not a question you forgot, a question that, if you're honest, you probably knew on some level should be asked but didn't, because of social risk, time pressure, or the discomfort of questioning a frame that everyone else seemed comfortable inside.
Write that question down. You don't have to do anything with it now.
But getting it into words is the first step toward being the person who asks it next time before it becomes a regret. The question audit, diagnosing your pattern. There's a manager, let's call her Priya, who has a reputation for being a good communicator. She runs weekly stand-ups. She checks in with her team constantly.
She asks questions all day long. How's it going? Where are we on that? Any blockers?
Her calendar is full of sync meetings.
Her Slack is a constant stream of check-ins.
She is, by any observable measure, someone who asks a lot of questions. And yet, her team keeps getting surprised. Deadlines slip not because of execution problems, but because the wrong thing was being built.
Projects sail past the point of no return before anyone realizes the goal was off target. Relationships fray quietly because the surface always looks fine. The team is always good until they're not. Priya isn't a bad manager. She's not lazy or incurious.
The problem is more subtle and more common than that. She has mistaken status questions for diagnostic questions, and over years of habit, the difference has become invisible to her.
A status question is a weather report. How are we doing? Any updates? Where do things stand?
These questions are not useless, you need weather reports. But they only tell you what the surface looks like right now. They don't tell you about the fault lines running underneath.
A diagnostic question is different in kind, not just degree. What's the actual blocker here, not the surface one, the real one? What are we assuming that we haven't tested? If this goes wrong, how would we know?
These questions probe the structure beneath the surface.
They're looking for cracks before the wall falls. The gap between these two types of questions is one of the most consequential gaps in professional and personal life, and most people have never been taught to see it. You can spend an entire career asking questions without ever asking the right kind. This chapter is about figuring out which patterns you've fallen into, and why.
Not to shame you out of them, every pattern in this chapter exists for a reason, usually a sensible one. But once you can see your pattern clearly, you can start to interrupt it deliberately. That's where better questioning begins, not with better vocabulary, but with honest diagnosis. Why pattern matters more than technique. Most advice about asking better questions focuses on technique. Use open-ended questions, avoid leading questions, ask follow-ups. That's useful, but it's downstream of a more fundamental issue. Technique is the how of a question. Pattern is the why, the underlying orientation that shapes what you even think to ask about. Think about it in terms of Don Norman's concept of mental models. In The Design of Everyday Things, Norman shows how people interact with complex systems based on their internal model of how those systems work. When the mental model is wrong, even skilled, intelligent people make systematic errors, not random ones, but predictable ones that follow the shape of the flawed model. The same applies to questioning. Your questioning pattern is your mental model of what questions are for. If your model is questions are a way to track progress, you'll ask status questions. If your model is questions are a way to show engagement, you'll ask questions that make you look attentive without necessarily surfacing anything useful. If your model is questions are inherently threatening, you'll avoid them altogether when the stakes feel high. And here's the key insight Norman keeps returning to: you don't experience yourself as using a flawed model. You experience yourself as just seeing reality clearly. The errors feel like external problems, not internal ones. Changing your questioning pattern requires something harder than learning a new technique. It requires examining the model that's been running quietly in the background and being willing to find it inadequate. This is uncomfortable. But discomfort here is a signal, not a warning. It means you found something real. The 4 patterns every questioning pattern is.
A solution to some problem, usually a social or cognitive problem that made the pattern adaptive at some point. Understanding why each pattern exists is as important as recognizing it. The status asker is the most common pattern in organizational life, which is partly why it's so hard to see from the inside. Status askers ask questions that generate reports rather than insight. They want to know where things are, not why things are the way they are. Their questions produce snapshots. This pattern often develops in response to real pressure, accountability structures, stakeholder demands, a culture that equates being informed with asking regularly. If your organization runs on dashboards, weekly reports, and stand-up meetings, you've been trained toward status questions. The system rewards the appearance of oversight even when the questions themselves are generating noise rather than signal. The deeper problem is that status questions create a false sense of understanding. When you ask how's it going, and someone says good, you've now received information. You feel informed. But good is not a diagnostic category, it's a social response. It tells you about the current emotional register of the person you asked, not about the health of the project or relationship you're trying to understand. In Ryan Singer's framework from Shape Up, there's a useful distinction between two phases of work, shaping and building. Shaping is the upstream work of defining what a problem really is and what an appropriate solution might look like. Building is the execution. The status asker almost always asks building questions: where are we? When will it be done? Even when the work is still in a shaping phase, when what's really needed is, do we understand this problem well enough to be building at all? The status asker's questions are also typically backward-looking. What did you accomplish this week is a reasonable question in some contexts. But it crowds out the more important forward question: what are you uncertain about that you haven't surfaced yet? If this sounds familiar, notice the underlying assumption that information has already been surfaced and your job is to collect it. Diagnostic questioning requires the opposite assumption, that the most important information is still hidden, and your job is to draw it out. The assumption confirmer doesn't ask questions to learn. They ask questions to validate. Their questions are shaped by conclusions they've already reached, and the questioning process is less an inquiry than a search for agreement with their existing view. This pattern has deep roots in cognitive science. Confirmation bias, the tendency to favor information that supports what we already believe, is one of the most robustly documented phenomena in human cognition. But confirmation bias in questioning is more active than passive. It's not just that you notice supporting evidence more. It's that you construct questions that, the assumption problem, what you don't know you're believing. In 2013, a product team at a well-funded startup spent 6 months building a feature they were proud of. The feature allowed users to customize their workflow in granular detail, dozens of settings, preferences, toggles. The engineering was elegant. The interface was clean. The product manager had personally championed it through 3 planning cycles and 2 rounds of investor updates. When they shipped it, almost no one used it. Not because users couldn't find it. Not because it was buggy or poorly designed. The feature worked exactly as intended. The problem was more fundamental: users didn't want to customize their workflow. They wanted the product to figure out the right workflow for them. The assumption buried at the base of 6 months of work, the assumption that users would value control over simplicity, had never been tested. It had been stated in planning meetings as background context, the kind of thing you say before getting to the real discussion. Everyone in the room had nodded. No one had asked, how do we know this is true? This kind of story is so common that it barely gets remarked on anymore. Teams ship features no one asked for. Leaders make strategic pivots based on intuitions that were never examined. People have difficult conversations they've been rehearsing for weeks, only to discover the conflict they were bracing for doesn't actually exist, replaced by a different, harder one they never anticipated. Relationships slowly calcify around misunderstandings that have been silently treated as facts since the second date. In every case, the mechanism is the same. An assumption gets made early, usually unconsciously, and then the entire downstream structure of questions, decisions, and actions gets built on top of it. By the time the assumption reveals itself as wrong, you've invested so much in the world it implies that challenging it feels like dismantling everything. So you don't. You ask better questions about the wrong premise, and you wonder why the answers keep failing you.
Why the brain treats assumptions like facts. The uncomfortable truth about assumptions is that your brain doesn't experience them as guesses. It experiences them as perceptions. Neuroscientist Andy Clark at the University of Edinburgh has spent decades developing what's called the predictive processing framework, a model of how the brain actually works that has become one of the most influential frameworks in cognitive science. The core insight is counterintuitive. The brain is not a passive receiver of sensory input.
It's an active prediction machine.
At every moment, your brain is generating a model of what's about to happen based on past experience, and then comparing that model to incoming sensory data. What you experience as seeing or understanding is actually the brain's prediction, lightly updated by reality where necessary.
This is efficient.
It's why you can read text with typos, recognize faces from odd angles, and navigate a familiar room in the dark.
The brain fills in the gaps so smoothly that you never notice it's doing so.
The prediction and the perception are functionally indistinguishable from the inside.
But this efficiency has a cost. When your model of how something works is wrong, the brain doesn't automatically flag the mismatch.
It suppresses the conflicting data and highlights the data that fits the model. Clark's colleague Carl Friston describes this as prediction error minimization. The brain works to reduce the gap between prediction and experience, but it does this as often by distorting the perception as by updating the model. You've had the experience of hearing what you expected someone to say rather than what they actually said.
That's not a communication failure.
That's predictive processing doing exactly what it's designed to do, at the cost of accuracy. Assumptions are the cognitive equivalent of these predictive models. They are prior beliefs that your brain has promoted to background facts, things
you process the world through rather than things you hold up for examination. And because they're background rather than foreground, they're invisible in exactly the moments when they're doing the most work.
The startup product team knew users wanted control. They didn't experience that as a hypothesis. They experienced it as the context within which they were working, as obvious and unremarkable as the fact that their office had walls. The question, then, is not how to stop making assumptions. That's neurologically impossible, and even if it weren't, it would be cognitively paralyzing. Assumptions are the substrate of all fast thinking. The question is how to surface the assumptions that matter before they cost you 6 months of work, or a relationship, or a strategic direction. And that requires a specific kind of question, one most people never think to ask.
The brakes? Mental model. The most useful question I know for surfacing load-bearing assumptions is this: what breaks if I'm wrong here? Not am I right?
That question is almost useless because your brain will answer it by reviewing the evidence you already found compelling.
Not what could go wrong.
That's too open. It generates a list of risks, not a diagnosis of assumptions. The specific formulation matters.
What breaks if I'm wrong?
Forces you to engage with consequences rather than probabilities. It makes the cost of the assumption concrete, which makes the assumption itself suddenly visible in a way it wasn't before. Here's how it works in practice.
Say you're 3 weeks into a product redesign. The redesign is based on the premise that users are confused by the current navigation. Before you go further, you stop and ask, what breaks if I'm wrong about that? If users aren't confused by navigation, then the redesign doesn't address the actual problem and you'd be 3 weeks into a solution for a symptom rather than a cause. What breaks is all of it.
The whole project. That's a load-bearing assumption, and now you know to test it before you're 6 weeks in. Or say you're having a difficult conversation with a partner about how they've been distant lately.
You're operating on the assumption that the distance is about something you did. You ask, what breaks if I'm wrong?
If the distance isn't about you, then a conversation framed as an apology or a defense is going to be deeply confusing to them. You'll be solving a problem that isn't there and missing the one that is. That's another load-bearing assumption, and it deserves a question before it gets a solution. The power of the breaks question is that it reverse engineers the assumption from its consequences.
You don't have to be aware that you're making an assumption to use it. You just have to be willing to ask, if the opposite were true, what would I have to throw out? Whatever the answer is, that's the assumption you haven't examined. Ryan Singer makes a related point in Shape Up when he talks about the difference between appetite and estimates. Most teams ask, "How long will this take?" before they've asked, "How much is this worth doing?" The first question presupposes the second, it assumes the thing is worth doing at all, and at roughly the scope you've imagined it. Singer argues for flipping the sequence. Start with appetite. What's the right amount of time and energy for a problem of this size, which forces you to interrogate the assumption that the problem is worth a large investment before you've committed to one. What breaks if I'm wrong about this being worth doing, is exactly the breaks question applied to project scoping. Don Norman and the problem of locked-in questions. Don Norman has a memorable way of describing how flawed mental models propagate. In The Design of Everyday Things, he describes a class of errors where the problem is not the execution but the framing, where people are solving the wrong problem skillfully, because the early questions they asked locked in a set of assumptions they never revisited. His canonical example involves door handles. A door that requires pushing has a handle that implies pulling, and users pull, fail, and feel stupid when the real problem is the designer's flawed model of how people interact with doors. The user is not wrong. The user's mental model is correct, this handle means pull. The designer's mental model was wrong, and it got encoded into the physical object, and now the error is invisible because it looks like user error. The same dynamic plays out in organizational and interpersonal life at every scale. When a team asks, "How do we make this feature more visible?" they've locked in the assumption that visibility is the problem. Every subsequent question will be about visibility, color, placement, size, animation. But if the real problem is that users don't understand what the feature does, not that they can't see it, then you can optimize visibility perfectly and solve nothing. The question, "How do we make this more visible?" doesn't just reflect a mental model, it reproduces it, because every person who hears the question starts thinking about visibility and stops thinking about anything else. This is the mechanism by which bad assumptions propagate through organizations. It's not that people are deceived by them. It's that the questions being asked actively inhibit the thinking that would reveal them. Each question that presupposes an assumption makes the assumption harder to see, because the question feels like due diligence, you're asking things, when it's actually a form of confirmation. The product team asking what's the best way to build the customization feature is not asking a bad question. It's just asking a question that makes the underlying assumption invisible. The corrective Norman points to his feedback loops, designing systems that surface mismatches between model and reality quickly and legibly. The question version of this is the breaks frame applied early, before the questions about execution begin. Before, "How do we build this?" ask, "What would have to be true for this to be worth building at all?" Whatever answers emerge, those are your assumptions. Now you can choose which ones to test. Reversibility radar, ranking your assumptions by cost. Not every assumption is equally dangerous. Some wrong assumptions cost you an afternoon. Others cost you 6 months, or a marriage, or a company. The reversibility radar helps you triage. The framework is simple. Every assumption sits somewhere on a spectrum between type 1 and type 2. Type 1 assumptions are hard to reverse. If you're wrong and you've already acted on them, the cost is large, durable, and difficult to undo. Type 2 assumptions are easy to reverse. If you're wrong, you can course correct quickly with minimal loss. A startup that builds its entire architecture around the assumption that it will have millions of concurrent users from day one has made a type 1 assumption. If they're wrong, if users never come, or come more slowly, they've over-engineered a system they can't easily undo. The same team making a type 2 assumption might be, users probably prefer dark mode. If they're wrong, they add a theme toggle. The cost is a few days of work. The reversibility question reframes how you think about assumptions before you act on them. It's not "Are we sure?" Because you're rarely sure, and waiting for certainty is its own kind of trap. It's "If we're wrong, what's the path back?" For type 2 assumptions, the answer is straightforward, and you can proceed quickly. For type 1 assumptions, the answer is painful or impossible, and that's precisely when the breaks question earns its keep. Type 1 assumptions deserve explicit examination before you move. Type 2 assumptions can be tested through action. The startup's customization feature was a type 1 assumption problem. The team was 6 months into a wrong belief before they got feedback.
A better application of the reversibility radar would have asked, early, how reversible is the decision to build a 6-month feature based on an untested
premise? The answer is not very.
That alone should have triggered an assumption audit before the build began, not because certainty was achievable, but because the cost of being wrong was high enough to warrant a week of testing before committing 6 months. In relationships, Type 1 assumptions are the ones that quietly shape the architecture of how you interact with someone over years.
She doesn't like talking about her family. He's not interested in that part of my life. They'd rather I just handle it than ask for help. These might be right. But if they're wrong, the cost isn't a minor correction, it's discovering that you've been having a subtly different relationship than you thought, for a long time. That's a Type 1 assumption, and it's worth asking what breaks if I'm wrong about this, before another year goes by. Running an assumption inventory. An assumption inventory is a structured practice of surfacing what you're treating as fact that hasn't been verified as fact. It works on projects, decisions, relationships, strategies, any domain where you're acting on a model of reality that might be wrong. The practice has 3 steps. First, you describe the situation in factual terms, what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what outcome you expect. Second, you go through that description and identify every place where you're relying on something being true that you haven't directly verified. You mark each one. Third, you apply the brakes question to each marked assumption. If this turns out to be false, what falls apart? The first pass usually surfaces the assumptions you already half know about, the ones you've been quietly hoping are true. The second and third passes surface the deeper ones, the ones that feel like obvious background facts. Those are typically the most dangerous, because they've been running longest without scrutiny. A useful heuristic for step 2, any sentence that contains the word obviously, clearly, everyone knows, or of course is hiding an assumption. Strip those words out and ask what's actually left. Obviously our users value simplicity becomes we believe our users value simplicity. Now it's a belief, not a fact, and beliefs get tested. Everyone knows the real blocker is budget becomes we believe the real blocker is budget. Now you might wonder, who is everyone? Has anyone asked? The inventory doesn't have to be long or formal. For a single project, you might generate a list of 8 to 12 assumptions and spend an hour sorting them by reversibility. That hour will tell you more about where your risk actually lives than any amount of status reporting. For larger decisions, whether to hire, whether to pivot, whether to have a hard conversation, the inventory is a premortem in assumption form. You're not imagining failure and working backward. You're surfacing the beliefs that failure would require to be false, and asking how confident you actually are in them. Assumptions in personal life. It's easy to think of assumption problems as organizational phenomena, things that happen to startups and product teams. But the mechanism is identical in personal life, and the costs there are often harder to quantify and slower to surface. Think about how many beliefs about another person you formed in the first few months of knowing them, and how rarely you've revisited those beliefs as the person changed or didn't change in the ways you assumed they would. We build remarkably stable models of the people closest to us, and we ask questions that confirm those models rather than questions that test them. Are you okay? Is a status asker question. I've noticed you seem quieter lately. Is there something specific going on? Is a diagnostic question. The second question is harder to ask, and it requires being willing to hear an answer that updates your model. That's the assumption examining move. Or consider how you approach decisions about your own life, career changes, where to live, how to spend your time. These decisions are built on a stack of assumptions about what you value, what you're good at, what trade-offs matter to you, and what the actual options are. Most of those assumptions were formed years ago, in different circumstances, and haven't been examined since. What breaks if I'm wrong about wanting stability is not a comfortable question. But it might be the most useful question you ask yourself this year. The breaks frame works here because it makes the stakes concrete. You're not asking, do I still want stability? Which is vague and easy to dismiss. You're asking, what would be different about my decisions if stability wasn't actually the priority I've been treating it as? That's specific. It leads somewhere. It might lead you to realize that the decisions you've been making in the name of stability are actually making you feel constrained, and that the assumption has been costing you something real. Practical reflection. This reflection asks you to do a brief assumption inventory on something real, not hypothetical, not abstract. Pick a current project, decision, or relationship situation that matters to you. 1. Write 2 to 3 sentences describing what you're doing and what you expect to happen. Be specific. 2. Go through what you wrote and underline or circle every place where you're relying on something being true without having directly verified it. Pay attention to any phrase that sounds like obviously or everyone knows or it's clear that. 3. List the 3 assumptions you feel least certain about from what you underlined. For each one, answer these questions. What would I need to see to confirm this is actually true? What breaks if it turns out to be false? Is this a type 1, hard to reverse, or type 2, easy to reverse, assumption? For each type 1 assumption you identified, what's one specific action you could take in the next week to test it before you've gone further down the current path? 5. For the assumption you're least certain about, the one where you felt the most resistance when writing down the answer to what breaks if it's false. Ask yourself honestly, have you been avoiding testing this assumption? If yes, write down why. The resistance is the signal. The assumption you least want to examine is usually the one doing the most structural work. You don't have to act on what you find immediately. But you do have to see it clearly before you can decide what to do with it. The surface level trap. Dr. Anita Patel had been treating the same patient for 11 months. The woman, mid-40s, came in every 6 weeks with debilitating migraines. They tried beta blockers. Then triptans. Then a strict migraine diary, no red wine, no aged cheese, no bright screens after 9. There were small improvements, then regressions, then plateaus. The migraines kept coming. It was at the 12th appointment that Dr. Patel did something different. She had been asking what triggers the migraines for nearly a year. That day, almost by accident, she asked something else. Why is this symptom appearing now, in this pattern? What changed about your life 11 months ago? The patient went quiet. Then she said, her mother had moved in with them. Not a bad thing, she emphasized quickly. But her mother kept different hours, reorganized the kitchen, commented on how she cooked, how she dressed, how she raised her kids. The household that had been her sanctuary had become, quietly, a source of relentless low-grade stress. Dr. Patel hadn't discovered a new drug. She had asked a different question, one that opened a door instead of closing it. Within 3 months, with some family counseling and a frank conversation between the patient and her mother, the migraines reduced by 70%. This is the surface-level trap. And it catches almost everyone. Why we stop at the first available answer. There's a concept in cognitive psychology called satisficing, a portmanteau of satisfying and sufficing coined by the economist and Nobel laureate Herbert Simon. The idea is that human beings don't actually optimize for the best possible answer. We optimize for the first answer that's good enough. We stop searching when we find something that clears the bar, not when we find the best thing above the bar. This made perfect evolutionary sense for most of human history. When you needed to find food, shelter, or a mate, waiting for the globally optimal solution often meant waiting until you were dead. Quick, good enough decisions kept people alive. The cognitive ease that comes from stopping at a workable answer was a survival advantage. But here's the problem: most of the meaningful questions in modern life are not problems where the first available answer is the right one. The migraine wasn't triggered by wine. The marriage conflict wasn't really about dishes. The product wasn't failing because the design was ugly. The employee wasn't underperforming because they were lazy. The first available answer, the surface explanation, is almost always a symptom masquerading as a cause. Daniel Kahneman, in his work on thinking systems, describes what he calls cognitive ease, the pleasant, frictionless feeling of engaging with something familiar and intuitive. Our brains actively prefer this state. When you ask a question and the first answer feels coherent, your brain rewards you with a small hit of cognitive satisfaction. The question feels answered. You feel like you understand. And then you stop. The insidious part is that you're not even aware you've stopped. The surface level answer doesn't feel incomplete. It feels complete. That's what makes the trap so effective. It doesn't feel like a trap at all. It feels like clarity.
The 5 Whys, a tool for drilling through the surface in the 1970s, Taichi Ono was trying to understand why machines kept breaking down on the Toyota production floor. He developed a deceptively simple technique. Whenever a problem occurred, he and his team would ask why? Not once, but 5 times in succession, with each answer becoming the subject of the next why. A machine stops working. Why? Because it overheated. Why? Because the coolant ran low. Why? Because the sensor that monitors coolant levels was faulty. Why? Because it was purchased from a supplier with a lower quality standard. Why? Because the procurement team was under pressure to cut costs in Q3, and the vendor change was never flagged to maintenance. Now you're not fixing a machine. You're looking at an organizational incentive structure that creates a systematic trade-off between short-term cost savings and long-term reliability. That's a completely different problem, and it's the real one. The genius of 5 Whys is that it forces you to stay uncomfortable. Each answer you get feels like a resting place, and 5 Whys says, don't rest yet. It treats the first answer as raw material for the next question, rather than as a destination. But the technique fails remarkably often in practice, and understanding why it fails is just as important as understanding how it works. The most common failure mode is that people answer why with blame rather than with systems. A machine breaks down. Why? Because Dave didn't follow the maintenance checklist. Why? Because Dave is careless. And that's where the whys stop. You found a villain, and the brain, again, seeking cognitive ease, accepts the narrative. But Dave is careless is almost never the real answer. Why wasn't the maintenance checklist designed to be easier to follow? Why didn't the system flag overdue checks automatically? Why didn't Dave feel he could raise concerns about the workload without being seen as making excuses? Amy Edmondson, the Harvard Business School professor who coined the term psychological safety, has documented extensively how organizations that lack safety for honest reporting tend to produce 5 Whys chains that terminate at individual blame rather than systemic causes. The technique doesn't fail on its own, it fails when the environment punishes honest answers. The second common failure is asking why, in a vacuum, without changing the questioner's perspective. If you're asking 5 Whys while standing inside your own assumptions, you'll get 5 answers that confirm your assumptions. The technique requires you to genuinely entertain the possibility that each layer of the onion might reveal something you didn't expect. If you already know what the root cause is before you start, you'll unconsciously steer the chain toward it. To use 5 Whys well, you need to treat each answer as a hypothesis rather than a fact. You're not building a logical proof. You're building a provisional map of a system, and you should be alert to the moments when the map surprises you. Those surprises are almost always where the real answer lives. The question that closes versus the question that opens. Here's a distinction that sounds simple but cuts very deep. Some questions close thinking, and some questions open it. A closing question is one where the answer ends the inquiry. Is this a good idea? Yes or no, the conversation stops. Who caused this problem? Once you name someone, the energy moves toward fixing blame, not fixing the system. How long will this take? Once you get a number, you're now managing against that number, whether or not it was meaningful to begin with. An opening question is one where the answer generates more questions, more angles, more productive uncertainty. What would need to be true for this to be a good idea? What conditions led to this problem? How much time is this problem actually worth to us? That last reframe, from how long will this take, to how much time is this problem worth, comes from Ryan Singer's work in Shape Up, the product development methodology he developed at Basecamp. Singer noticed that estimation questions were poisoning the well of product conversations. When teams asked how long something would take, they were asking engineers to make a prediction about an inherently uncertain future, under social pressure to give a confident answer. The answer was almost always wrong, and then everyone spent the next several weeks managing the gap between the estimate and reality. But how much time is this problem worth is a completely different question. It puts the team in the position of the decision maker, not the predictor. It forces the team to articulate what they believe about the value of solving the problem before committing resources to solving it. And it leads
Naturally, to a conversation about scope, if this problem is worth 2 weeks, what can we solve in 2 weeks? What's the smallest version of the solution that's meaningful? That's a productive conversation. It's an opening question disguised as a scheduling question. The key difference between closing and opening questions is whether they invite you to think harder or let you stop thinking. Most of us, most of the time, are drawn toward closing questions because thinking is effortful and answers are satisfying. But in the domains that matter most, diagnosis, design, relationships, strategy, opening questions are almost always more valuable. The interesting question trap. There's a cousin of the surface level trap that catches a different kind of person, the intellectually curious. Call it the interesting question trap. The interesting question trap is when you ask what's intellectually fascinating rather than what's actionable. It's easy to fall into if you're smart and curious, because intellectually interesting questions are genuinely enjoyable to explore. The problem is that enjoyment and usefulness are not the same thing. A startup team trying to understand why their user retention is dropping might find themselves in a long, genuinely interesting conversation about the psychology of habit formation, the works of B.J. Fogg and Nir Eyal, the neurological basis of reward cycles. All fascinating. None of it will tell them why users are churning out of their product on day 7. That requires a different, less glamorous question: what are the users who churn actually doing in the app on days 5 through 7, compared to the users who stay? The interesting question expands. The actionable question narrows. Both kinds of questions are valuable, but they serve different purposes, and the failure mode is using an interesting question when what you need is an actionable one. You can often tell which kind of question you're asking by paying attention to what happens after you answer it. If answering the question makes you want to read more, think more, explore further, it's probably an interesting question. If answering the question immediately suggests something you should do differently, it's probably an actionable one. Neither is inherently superior. But knowing which mode you're in is essential. A lot of intellectual effort gets spent on fascinating questions that ultimately produce no decisions, no changes, no consequences. The surface level trap catches you when you stop too early. The interesting question trap catches you when you never arrive at anything you can use. Breaks? What breaks if I'm wrong? Before you commit to any answer, even a 5-wise answer, even an answer you've worked hard to reach, there's a question worth asking that acts as a final filter. What breaks if I'm wrong about this? This is not pessimism. It's epistemic hygiene. When you've invested time and reasoning toward a conclusion, you've also invested psychologically in that conclusion. The more effort you've put in, the more resistant you become to evidence that challenges it, a phenomenon called the sunk cost fallacy in economics and effort justification in psychology. The breaks? Question is a deliberate circuit breaker for this tendency. Dr. Patel, in our opening story, had invested 11 months in the hypothesis that migraines had environmental or dietary triggers. That's a significant investment. Asking what breaks if I'm wrong about this might have led her earlier to question whether the trigger was physiological at all, whether the framing of trigger was even the right frame for this patient. The question works by forcing you to specify the consequences of being wrong. Not just I might be wrong, which is abstract, but if I'm wrong, then X will happen, Y will be wasted, Z will go unsolved. Concrete consequences create concrete incentives to ask better questions before you commit. This is especially important in domains where the cost of a wrong answer is asymmetric, or being wrong once is worse than being cautious many times. In medicine, in engineering, in any domain where decisions are hard to reverse, the breaks question is not optional. It's the difference between a diagnostic process and a guess with extra steps. Scope creep is a questioning failure. Ryan Singer makes another observation in Shape Up that deserves attention here. Scope creep, the tendency of projects to expand endlessly beyond their original boundaries, is not primarily a project management failure. It's a questioning failure. Projects expand when the initial questions were underspecified. When the team began by asking how do we improve the onboarding experience, rather than what is the single most painful moment in onboarding for a new user who almost gives up, the scope was never bounded. Any improvement to onboarding is technically in scope. The question itself invited infinite expansion. Singer calls these rabbit holes directions that look promising but keep revealing new complexity without producing anything shippable.
And the entry into a rabbit hole is almost always a question that seemed clear enough to start work on but was actually still at the surface level. You started answering it before you drilled deep enough to understand what you were actually solving.
The corrective is not more detailed specifications or stricter project management.
The corrective is better questioning at the start, before a single line of code is written or a single decision is made. The work of sharpening the question is not preamble to the real work, it is the real work.
Everything downstream of a well-formed question is comparatively easy.
Everything downstream of a poorly formed one is a series of corrections that never quite adds up. What makes Singer's appetite reframe so useful is that it shifts the locus of uncertainty.
Estimation puts uncertainty in the future. We don't know how long this will take. Appetite puts uncertainty in the present. We haven't yet agreed on how much this is worth to us. The second kind of uncertainty is much more tractable.
You can have a conversation about value.
You can compare this problem against other problems. You can make a deliberate call.
You cannot have a useful conversation about how long something will take before you've understood it well enough to know what you're building, which, of course, you don't know when you're still asking a surface-level question. The gulf between intention and outcome. Don Norman, in The Design of Everyday Things, describes two gaps that explain why designed objects fail people.
The gulf of execution is the gap between what you want to do and what the object lets you do.
The gulf of evaluation is the gap between what the object does and whether you can tell it worked.
These same gulfs appear in the domain of questions.
When you ask a surface-level question, you create your own gulf of execution. You think you're asking about the problem, but the question you formed doesn't actually reach the problem. You're pressing a button that looks like it should do something, and the system is going through the motions, but the real issue sits untouched behind the interface.
The gulf of evaluation is equally treacherous.
After you get an answer to a surface question, you often can't tell whether the answer is adequate because you're evaluating the answer against the question you asked, not against the problem you actually have. If you asked why is the user not completing checkout, and the answer is the checkout flow has too many steps, you have an answer to your question.
It might even be a true answer.
But if the real problem is that users don't trust the payment page's security signals, reducing the number of steps won't fix anything. You'll evaluate the intervention against the question and conclude it failed for some other reason, probably another surface reason, and you'll be back at the beginning, having wasted the time between. This is one of the most expensive patterns in product development, in healthcare, and in any domain that involves diagnosis. The intervention was correct relative to the question asked, and wrong relative to the actual problem. The gulf of evaluation hides this from you, because you keep measuring the wrong thing. The way through both gulfs is the same. Before committing to an answer, test whether your question actually reaches the problem.
A useful practice is to ask yourself, if the answer to my question is X, what will I do? And would doing that actually address the thing I'm worried about?
If you can trace a clear path from the answer to a meaningful action on the real problem, your question might be at the right level. If there's a disconnect, if the answer would tell you something but wouldn't actually change anything, you're probably still at the surface. When you know but won't ask, there is a specific variant of the surface-level trap that is worth naming separately, because it's driven not by cognitive laziness but by something more uncomfortable: avoidance. Sometimes people stay at the surface not because they haven't thought of the deeper question, but because they have and they're afraid of where it leads. The doctor who doesn't ask what changed in your life recently, because she doesn't have time for what the patient might share. The manager who doesn't ask, is there something about this role that isn't working for you, because he's afraid the answer is yes and he doesn't know how to respond. The couple who never ask, do we actually want the same kind of life, because the question is too large and too threatening to hold in the room. This avoidance is completely human, and it's worth being honest about it. The surface-level trap is not always about not knowing the deeper question. Sometimes it's about not being ready to ask it. And that's a different problem, with a different solution. The cognitive trap is solved by technique 5 Whys, the brakes. Check, reframing estimation as appetite. The avoidance trap is solved by courage, and by creating the conditions emotional, relational, institutional, where honesty feels safe enough to attempt. What you can do, even when you're not ready to ask the real question out loud, is write it down. Keep a private record of the questions you know you're not asking. You'll often find, returning to the list weeks or months later, that some of the questions you feared have become less frightening, or that the cost of not asking them has become more visible. Either way, naming the question you're avoiding is a form of honesty that makes it more likely you'll eventually ask it when it matters. Practical reflection: pick one problem you're currently living with, professional, personal, or practical. It should be something you've already thought about, already have some explanation for. Now run the 5 whys on it honestly. 1. Write the problem as a statement. The problem is .. 2. Ask why this problem exists. Write your answer in a single sentence. 3. Ask why that is true. Write your answer in a single sentence. 4. Ask why that is true. Write your answer. 5. Ask why that is true. Write your answer. 6. Ask why that is true. Write your answer. Now look at what you wrote at level 5. Is it different from what you would have said if someone had asked you to explain the problem before you started? Most people find that it is. Some find that the 5th answer points to something they knew but hadn't wanted to name. 2 additional questions to sit with. At which level did you feel most resistance to continuing? That's usually where the interesting information is. Is your level 5 answer something that can be acted on? If not, you may have drifted into an interesting question rather than an actionable one. Ask yourself, what would need to change for this answer to become actionable? You don't need to solve anything today. The purpose of this reflection is to notice where you had been stopping and to feel, once, what it's like to keep going. Questions and relationships: they had been arguing about the dishes for 6 years. Not constantly, they were a functional couple, by most measures a happy one. But the dishes were a recurring flashpoint. She felt like she was always the one cleaning up. He felt like he cleaned up plenty and she was holding him to an unreasonable standard. They had the argument in variations, about the dishes, about the bathroom counter, about how long things could sit on the kitchen table before someone dealt with them. They tried chore charts. They tried having calm, rational conversations about it. They tried not talking about it at all for a few months, which only built pressure. The wrong question was, why won't you just do the dishes? They were so locked into this question that they had never asked the one underneath it. A couples therapist finally named it in their 3rd session, almost as an aside. It sounds like you two might have genuinely different ideas about what a clean home feels like, and different assumptions about who's responsible for managing the gap. Have you ever talked about that directly? They hadn't. Because the question, why won't you just do the dishes, was a question about compliance, about whether one person would change their behavior to meet the other's expectations. The question underneath it was about whether they had compatible standards, compatible values, compatible frameworks for shared responsibility. That's not a question about dishes. That's a question about how 2 people are going to build a life together. Once they asked the right question, they discovered they genuinely disagreed on what clean meant, not in a petty way, but in a deep, long-formed, culturally influenced way. Her family had grown up with one standard, his with another. Neither standard was objectively correct. But because they'd never surfaced this, they'd both been operating as if their own standard was the obvious default, and the other person was simply failing to meet it. This is what bad questions do to relationships. They don't just fail to solve problems. They actively generate conflict, because they frame the other person as the obstacle rather than the system as the thing to examine. Interrogation versus inquiry: there are 2 fundamentally different postures a question can carry, and they feel completely different to the person being asked. Interrogation is a question in search of a specific answer, usually a confession, a concession, or a validation of what the questioner already believes. Why did you do that? Is almost always an interrogation. It implies that the action was wrong and demands the other person justify themselves. Even if the questioner is genuinely curious, the grammatical structure of the question puts the other person in the dock. The person being asked either defends themselves or capitulates. Neither response produces understanding. Inquiry is a question genuinely open to unexpected answers. What were you trying to achieve is an inquiry. It doesn't presuppose error. It invites the other person to share their frame of reference, their intention, their internal logic. And very often, when you hear that logic, the behavior that seemed inexplicable or infuriating becomes comprehensible, not necessarily acceptable, but comprehensible.
And comprehensible problems are solvable in ways that inexplicable ones aren't.
The researcher Brené Brown, who has spent decades studying vulnerability and human connection, identifies this as one of the core practices of what she calls armored versus daring leadership. Armored leaders ask questions designed to confirm what they already think. Daring leaders ask questions designed to genuinely learn something.
The difference is not always in the words. It's in the posture.
It's in whether you're holding the question open or steering toward a predetermined destination. Most people, when they're hurt, angry, or anxious, default to interrogation.
This is understandable.
When you're in a threat state, you're not looking for nuance, you're
looking for resolution, and interrogation feels like it moves toward resolution. But it almost never does.
It typically escalates the conflict, because the person being interrogated feels judged, not understood, and defensiveness doesn't produce honesty.
The power dynamic hidden in every question who asks shapes who answers. This is one of the most underappreciated dynamics in human communication. Questions are not neutral requests for information.
They're assertions about who holds authority in a conversation. When you ask someone why, you are positioning yourself as an evaluator of their reasoning.
When you ask what were you thinking, you are implying that their thinking was questionable.
When a manager asks how is the project going, they are exercising the prerogative of someone who believes they have the right to a status update, and the subordinate knows, without it ever being said, that the expected answer is fine. This power structure is mostly invisible, which is what makes it so pervasive. You don't need to intend to create a power dynamic for one to exist. The structure of the question itself does the work. And this is why identical questions can land completely differently depending on who's asking. How are you doing? From a close friend opens something. How are you doing? From your boss, 3 days before performance reviews, carries a completely different weight. Don Norman, in his writing about the design of everyday things, introduces the concept of affordances, the properties of an object that signal how it should be used.
A well-designed door handle affords pulling.
A push plate affords pushing. When you install a pull handle on a door that should be pushed, people pull it not because they're stupid, but because the design invited them to.
The handle created a false expectation. Conversations work the same way. Certain question structures afford defensiveness.
Why did you do that? Affords justification.
Don't you think you should have? Affords agreement or conflict. What's wrong with you? Affords shame.
These questions are handles on push doors.
They invite exactly the response that will be least useful.
Re-engineering those questions, replacing "why did you do that?" with "what were you going for?" or "help me understand what happened," isn't just a politeness strategy.
It's a design change.
You're changing the affordances of the conversation. You're installing a handle that invites the person to walk through the door rather than push against it.
The management question that never works: how is the project going? This is one of the most common questions in management, and one of the least useful.
On the surface it seems reasonable. You're a manager, you want to know the status of work, you're asking.
But think about what the question actually does. It's a status question, and status questions have a known answer. The known answer is fine or good or on track.
Anyone who has ever been in an organization knows that saying "it's going badly" or "we're actually quite stuck" in response to a casual status question requires a level of candor that most organizational environments don't reliably support.
So people say fine, and the manager nods, and real information never surfaces. Compare this to diagnostic questions. What's the thing that's most likely to slow this down? What decision are you waiting on that's blocking progress? If you could change one thing about how this is resourced, what would it be? These are questions that make it easy to share real information, because they're not asking for an overall verdict, they're asking for specific, actionable intelligence.
They also implicitly signal that the manager expects there to be complexity, which removes the stigma of admitting to it. Edgar Schein, the organizational psychologist who spent decades at MIT studying organizational culture and leadership, made a distinction between tell leadership and ask leadership and found that the quality of a leader's questions was one of the strongest predictors of the quality of information that flowed upward to them.
Leaders who asked broad, evaluative questions got curated, sanitized answers. Leaders who asked specific, curious, non-evaluative questions got real ones.
This applies equally to parenting, to mentorship, to friendship.
How was school? Produces fine. What was the most annoying thing that happened today? Produces a conversation.
The specificity of the question signals genuine curiosity, and genuine curiosity is the only reliable invitation for genuine disclosure. The reversibility radar in relationships: some questions can be asked again later, after you've learned more, after the relationship has deepened, after the moment is right.
Other questions, once asked, cannot be unasked.
They change the relationship permanently, not always badly, but irrevocably. Asking your partner, "Do you actually love me?" is a type 1 question in the reversibility framework.
It's not reversible.
Once asked, both of you know the asking happened. If the question came from a place of genuine doubt, and your partner knows that, something has shifted in the architecture of the relationship, regardless of what they answer.
There may be very good reasons to ask it.
But it should be asked with full awareness that it cannot be unfiled. Asking your team member, "Is there something going on with you personally that's affecting your work?" is also type 1.
Even if they say no, the question has registered.
They now know you've noticed something. That can be a gift, if the question is asked with genuine care. It can be a threat, if the context makes care hard to believe. Contrast these with type 2 relationship questions, the kind you can revisit, revise, come back to without permanent consequence.
Would you rather do this or that for dinner? Is this a good time to talk? How are you finding the new arrangement?
These are lightweight, easily revised, easily forgotten.
They're not unimportant, but they don't carry weight that outlasts the conversation. The key insight is that many people treat serious, high-stakes relationship questions the same way they treat lightweight ones, as things you ask when they occur to you, without thinking about timing or framing or what you're prepared to hear.
And then they're surprised when a question lands as an accusation, or when the honest answer creates a rupture they weren't ready for. The reversibility radar asks you to pause before a high-stakes question and recognize, this one has consequences I can't undo.
Not to avoid asking it, sometimes type 1 questions desperately need to be asked.
But to ask them deliberately, with care, with thought given to what you're hoping to achieve and what you're prepared to receive. Status questions versus curiosity questions. Edgar Schein, the MIT organizational psychologist, made a distinction that's worth carrying into every relationship you have, not just the ones at work. He differentiated between what he called tell interactions, where you assert information and expect acknowledgement, and ask interactions, where you genuinely open space for something you don't already know. Most of the questions we ask in close relationships are actually tell interactions in disguise.
Don't you think it would be better if, is not a question? It's a position, followed by a request for validation. How could you have done that, is not a question. It's a judgment, followed by a demand for explanation.
The grammatical form is interrogative, but the conversational intent is assertion. And the person you're talking to can tell the difference immediately, even if they can't articulate how they know. Genuine curiosity questions are rare in most relationships, and this is partly because genuine curiosity requires accepting that you might hear something that changes your view, which is uncomfortable when you already feel certain you're right. It requires the willingness to be surprised, to discover that the person you thought you understood has interior logic you hadn't
accounted for. There's a phrase used in some therapeutic traditions, not knowing.
It's the posture of approaching a conversation without a predetermined narrative about what the other person meant, felt, or intended, holding the frame loosely enough to revise it based on what they actually say.
It doesn't mean pretending you have no perspective.
It means being genuinely willing to update your perspective when the evidence calls for it. Most conflicts in close relationships persist not because the problems are genuinely unsolvable but because both people are asking questions designed to confirm their existing narrative rather than questions designed to actually inquire into the other person's experience. Building a questioning culture in any group, a team, a family, a friendship circle, the quality of questions that get asked is largely a function of culture, not individual intelligence. You can have the smartest people in the world in a room and still have a culture where the real questions never get asked, because the implicit norms punish honest inquiry.
Amy Edmondson's research on psychological safety is the most rigorous treatment of this problem in organizational settings.
Her finding, replicated across industries and contexts, is that teams with high psychological safety, where people genuinely believe they can ask questions and raise concerns without social punishment, consistently outperform teams without it, even when the teams without safety have higher individual talent.
The mechanism is straightforward.
Asking a real question, one that exposes uncertainty, challenges an assumption, surfaces a potential problem, requires a willingness to be temporarily vulnerable. You're signaling that you don't know something, or that you think something might be wrong, or that you need more information. In environments where not knowing is treated as weakness, or where challenging leadership is treated as disloyalty, the rational response is to stop asking real questions.
And when real questions stop being asked, real problems stop being identified before they become crises. Building a questioning culture doesn't require a culture overhaul. It often starts with one person who models the behavior, the manager who says, "I don't know, what do you think?" The parent who says, "That's a really good question, I hadn't thought about it that way." The team lead who opens a project review not with, "How is it going?" but with, "What's the most important thing I should know that I probably don't?" In family systems, this looks like making genuine curiosity the norm, not curiosity as performance, not asking "How was your day?" as a ritual, but actually pausing when someone says something that surprises you and following the thread. Children raised in households where questions are treated as valuable, where why is welcomed rather than deflected, develop fundamentally different relationships to uncertainty and inquiry than those raised in households where questions are treated as challenge or inconvenience. The family therapist Virginia Satter, who worked with family systems for decades, observed that the families she worked with who were most in distress tended to share one characteristic: they had developed rigid, unexamined ways of framing problems that made certain questions unaskable. The work of therapy, she found, was less about resolving the specific conflict than about reopening the questions the family had stopped being able to ask. The specific cost of asking too late. One category of relational questioning failure that rarely gets discussed is the failure of timing, asking the right question years too late. In many long-term relationships, both romantic and professional, there are questions that should have been asked at the beginning that were instead deferred because they seemed too direct, too exposing, or simply too soon. What do you actually want from this relationship in 5 years? Do you want children, and how strongly? How important is financial security to you? Really, not just intellectually, but in your gut? What are your non-negotiables? These aren't uncomfortable questions because they're aggressive.
They're uncomfortable because they require honesty about things people are often still figuring out for themselves.
But the cost of deferring them is substantial.
When you avoid the meaningful question early, you implicitly answer it anyway. You proceed as if the answer is what you hope it to be, and you build structure on top of that assumption. Years later, when the assumption can't hold anymore, the conversation that should have happened at the start has to happen inside an architecture that makes it exponentially harder to hear honestly. The couple who never asked each other about children discovers the question in year 4 of a marriage. The business partners who never asked about their respective exit strategies discover it when one of them wants to sell and the other doesn't. The right question asked at the wrong time is still costly. But the right question asked several years after the wrong time is a different kind of costly, one that often involves the dismantling of something that was built on a premise that was never actually established. The reversibility radar applies here in a specific way. Some questions are type 1 not because of what happens when you ask them, but because of what happens when you don't. The decision to defer the question can itself be the irreversible act. The question underneath the question. In almost every significant relational conflict, there is a surface question and a deeper one. The couple fighting about dishes was asking a surface question about compliance. The deeper question was about compatible values and who bears the labor of maintaining the shared environment. The employee asking their manager for a raise is asking a surface question about money. The deeper question is often about whether their contribution is recognized, whether they matter to the organization. The error is not asking the surface question. The error is believing you've asked the real question when you've only asked the surface one. John Gottman, the psychologist who has spent 40 years studying couples in his love lab at the University of Washington, found that the most corrosive pattern in relationships is not conflict itself but what he calls contempt, the sense that one person's concerns, needs, or perspective are fundamentally not worth taking seriously. And contempt, in his research, almost always begins with questions that stop at the surface, questions that treat the other person as a problem to be managed rather than a perspective to be understood.
The antidote is not learning to ask nicer questions. It's developing the habit of treating every answer you get as the beginning of the next question, not the end of the inquiry. It's the relational equivalent of 5 whys. What are you telling me? What's underneath that? What do you need me to understand that I'm probably missing? This is slower. It requires more patience than most people bring to conversations. It requires tolerating the discomfort of not knowing and not being finished.
But the relationships built on this quality of inquiry, where both people feel genuinely questioned into, not just responded to, are the ones that last and that grow. Practical reflection. Think of one relationship in your life, a partner, a family member, a colleague, a friend, where there is a recurring tension or difficulty that never quite resolves, no matter how many times you talk about it.
1. Write down the question you've been asking in that relationship. Not necessarily literally, it might be the framing that governs your thinking. Why won't they just? Why do they always? When will they finally? 2. Ask yourself, is this question an interrogation or an inquiry? Does it assume error, or does it genuinely leave room for a different explanation? 3. Ask yourself, what is the question underneath this question? If you were to strip away this specific behavior you're focused on and look at the system, the underlying values, needs, assumptions, or fears, what would you find? Write one question you could ask the other person, not to confront them, but to genuinely learn something you don't currently know about how they experience this situation. 5. Before you ask it, apply the reversibility radar. Is this a question you can ask tentatively, with low stakes, or is it a type 1 question that changes things once it's in the air? If it's type 1, think about when and how you'd ask it, not whether. You don't need to have the conversation today. But writing the question down, the real one, the one underneath the one you've been asking, is itself a form of progress. The 7-day question reset. You've recognized something most people never do: the questions you've been asking aren't actually working. Maybe you spotted yourself in the assumption, confirm, or description, someone who asks questions that are really just statements in disguise, looking for a nod rather than new information. Maybe you recognized the status asker, someone who fills conversations with "how's it going?" and "any updates," without ever surfacing what's actually happening beneath the surface. That recognition is not a small thing. Most people float through their entire professional and personal lives never realizing that their questions have a quality problem. They wonder why decisions keep going sideways, why projects stall, why conversations feel unproductive, and they blame the other people, the circumstances, the complexity of modern life. They never look at the questions. You looked. Now let's do something with that. This chapter is a 7-day protocol. It's not a series of clever tricks. It's a structured reset, the minimum viable commitment to interrupt your existing question habits and begin building new ones. 7 days is short enough that you can commit to it fully, and long enough that you'll start to see real patterns. You don't need to be in a particular job or life situation. The practices here work equally well for a product manager trying to run better discovery sessions, a parent trying to have more honest conversations with their teenager, someone working through a career decision, or a designer trying to understand what's actually wrong with a feature. Questions are universal. So is the reset. Before you start, what you're actually doing. The 7-day reset isn't about asking better questions in the abstract. It's about developing 3 specific capacities. First, awareness, the ability to notice questions as they're happening, rather than asking them reflexively and moving on. Most of your current questions are invisible to you. They feel natural, even inevitable. The first job of this reset is to make them visible. Second, the habit of stakes, the ability to pause before a significant question and run a quick check. What breaks if I'm wrong about the assumption behind this question? This is the breaks framework in its most basic form. You're not yet doing deep structural analysis. You're just inserting a moment of reflection between the impulse to ask and the act of asking. Third, drilling, the habit of not accepting the first answer to a question, or even the first question itself, as the right one. The 5 whys practice trains you to pursue the root of a problem rather than its symptoms. None of these are difficult in isolation.
What makes them hard is that they require you to slow down in situations where speed feels like the point.
Meetings move fast. Conversations have momentum.
You will feel the pull to skip the check, skip the drill, fire off the quick question, and keep moving. That pull is exactly what this reset is designed to interrupt. The 5 core daily practices. Practice 1, the daily question audit. 5 minutes, every evening, before you wind down, spend 5 minutes reviewing 3 questions you asked today.
They don't have to be the most important ones, just 3 you can remember. For each one, ask yourself a single evaluating question. Did this question change anything?
The mechanism here is simple but important. A question that changes nothing, that gets a response you already expected, that confirms what you already believed, that generates no new information, is a closed question. It was never really asking. It was performing curiosity while staying comfortable. The audit trains you to detect the difference between a question that opened something up and a question that just filled silence. You don't need to judge yourself harshly for closed questions.
You'll ask them constantly, especially in the first week. The point of the audit is not punishment, it's calibration.
Over time, you develop an internal standard. A question should be
able to change my understanding. If it can't, I should ask a different one. Write your 3 questions down. 1 sentence each. Add a yes or no. Did it change anything?
That's the entire practice.
Practice 2, the breaks.
Check before any significant question. Before you send that message, raise that issue in a meeting, have that hard conversation, pause and ask yourself, what is the assumption behind this question, and what breaks if that assumption is wrong? The mechanism is this: every question you ask contains a hidden claim. When you ask why is this taking so long, you're claiming that something is taking too long, and that the cause is findable. When you ask, do you still love me, you're claiming that love is the variable in question. When you ask which design should we go with, you're claiming that the decision is between the designs you've already generated, not something you haven't thought of yet. Those hidden claims are assumptions.
They might be right. They often are.
But when they're wrong, the question leads you confidently in the wrong direction. The breaks check is a 2-second test that forces the assumption into view before you commit to the question. Practically, before you ask something significant, take 1 breath and mentally finish the sentence: if I'm wrong about, then. If what comes after then is serious, the conversation goes badly, the project heads down the wrong path, you miss something important, you found an assumption worth examining.
You might still ask the same question. Or you might ask a better one.
Practice 3, 1 5 whys drill per day. Pick 1 problem you're dealing with, any problem, work or personal, large or small, and run it through the 5 whys.
Ask why it's happening. Take the answer and ask why that's happening. Take that answer and ask why. 5 times, or until you can't go further. The mechanism is interrupting symptom-level thinking. Most of the time, when we encounter a problem, we ask a question at the level of the symptom: how do I fix this, or who is responsible for this? Both questions accept the symptom as the thing being addressed. The 5 whys is a deliberate downward drill. It refuses to accept the first explanation as the real explanation. You'll find that most everyday problems are symptoms of something 2 or 3 levels below where you first looked. The project is late not because people are slow, but because the requirements weren't clear, which happened because nobody asked the hard question in the kickoff meeting, which happened because the kickoff was treated as a formality. Once you're at that level, you have an actual lever. How do we run better kickoffs is a real question. How do we make people faster is not. Do this once a day. Write it down: 5 whys in 5 lines. It takes 5 minutes. What you're building is the reflex to look below the first answer. Practice 4, replace 1 status question per meeting. In every meeting or significant conversation, identify 1 status question you're tempted to ask: how's that coming along, any updates on X, where are we with that? And replace it with a diagnostic question. The mechanism: status questions ask where things are. Diagnostic questions ask what's actually happening and why. How's the launch prep going is a status question. What's the thing most likely to go wrong with the launch is a diagnostic question. One produces a report. The other produces insight. This doesn't mean you never ask for status. It means you recognize that status is almost never what you actually need. What you need is to understand the system, where the friction is, what the real blockers are, what people are worried about but haven't said. Diagnostic questions get at that. Status questions get you a summary. One per meeting is a deliberately small ask. You don't have to overhaul your entire communication style in a week. You just have to replace one. Practice 5, the end of day unasked question at the end of each day. Write down, in one sentence, the question you haven't asked yet. Not the question you want to ask tomorrow. The question that's been hovering, that you've been avoiding, that feels too direct or too uncomfortable or too revealing. The question whose answer you might not like. The mechanism, our most important questions are often the ones we're most reluctant to voice. We avoid them because asking makes the uncertainty real. As long as you haven't asked whether the relationship is working, you don't have to deal with the possibility that it isn't. As long as you haven't asked whether the strategy is sound, you don't have to face the possibility that it needs to change. The unasked question is where the real work lives. You don't have to ask the question you identify. Not yet. The practice is simply to name it, to bring it out of the fog of avoidance and into clear language. That alone is harder than it sounds, and more valuable than it seems. The Day-by-Day Guide Day 1, just notice today's only real job is awareness. Run the 5 practices: audit, breaks, check, 5 whys, diagnostic swap, unasked question, but hold them loosely. Don't force brilliance. You're developing a new muscle and it hasn't found its range of motion yet. What resistance looks like today, the practices will feel awkward and slightly performative. You'll do the audit and feel like you're making things up. You'll try the breaks, check, and not be sure whether you're doing it right. This is normal. The discomfort is not evidence that you're doing it wrong, it's evidence that you're actually doing something new. What progress looks like today: you completed all 5 practices and wrote something down for each one, even if what you wrote feels thin. Day 2, notice the pattern by today, you have yesterday's data. Look at your audit. What kind of questions did you ask yesterday? Were they mostly status questions, confirmation questions, or something else? Don't analyze deeply, just notice. What resistance looks like today: you'll want to skip the 5 whys because nothing big enough happened. Resist this. Pick the smallest, most mundane problem and run it. The 5 whys on why you're procrastinating on a single email is just as useful as running it on a project crisis. What progress looks like today: you noticed at least one moment today where you were about to ask a closed question and you caught it before you asked. Day 3, the first friction. This is often the hardest day. The novelty has worn off and the practices feel like chores. You might be wondering if this is doing anything. It is, but the results are mostly internal at this stage, and internal results are easy to discount. Today's focus: go deeper on the breaks, check. Don't just identify the assumption, write down what would actually break if you're wrong. Force yourself to finish the sentence completely. What resistance looks like today: it'll feel like you're overthinking simple things. A colleague asks you a question and before you answer you're running a breaks, check on their question and wondering if that's even the right question for them to be asking. This hyper-awareness is temporary and mildly exhausting. It means the practice is working. What progress looks like today: one question today felt genuinely different, more honest, more direct, more likely to produce something useful. Day 4, apply it to something real. By now you have a small bank of unasked questions from your end-of-day writing. Choose one. Ask it today. It doesn't have to be the most terrifying one. Just one that you've been deferring. What resistance looks like today: you'll rationalize that today isn't the right time. It rarely is. Ask anyway, or at minimum, take one concrete step toward asking. What progress looks like today: you asked a question today that made a conversation go somewhere unexpected. Not necessarily somewhere comfortable, just somewhere real. Day 5, the 5 whys in a real conversation. Instead of running the 5 whys privately in your notebook, try it out loud in a conversation. You don't have to say, "I'm going to do the 5 whys on this." Just ask why when someone gives you an explanation, and keep asking. 5 times, or until you reach something that actually matters. What resistance looks like today: People sometimes get defensive when you keep asking why. That's information. It tells you you've found an assumption they're not comfortable examining. What progress looks like today: you got to a fourth or fifth why and the answer surprised you. Or it surprised the person you were talking to. Day 6, audit the gap. Review your tracking table for the week. Look at the key question asked column and the what it unlocked column. Where is the unlocking the most sparse? That's where your question habits are still weakest. Today's focus: deliberately apply the practice you've done the least well this week. If you've been skipping the diagnostic swap in meetings, do it twice today. If your unasked questions have all been trivial, write an honest one tonight. What resistance looks like today: you'll have the impulse to feel good about how far you've come and ease off. That impulse is the beginning of the old pattern reasserting itself. Notice it. What progress looks like today: you caught a closed question, rewrote it in your head as a diagnostic question, and asked the diagnostic version instead. Day 7, integration. Today is not about adding new practices. It's about noticing that the practices are beginning to feel less mechanical. Some of them, maybe the audit, maybe the breaks check, have started to happen semi-automatically. Take 20 minutes today to write a short reflection. What question have you been asking your whole life that now looks like the wrong question? Don't force an answer. Just sit with the question. What progress looks like today: you can name one thing that is clearer to you than it was 7 days ago because of a question you asked or a question you stopped asking. The slip protocol: you will miss a day. Possibly two. Life is real and the reset doesn't live in a controlled environment. Here is the rule: 2 missed days is not a reset. It's a pause. You don't start over at day 1. You pick up where you left off and continue. The streak is not the point, the practice is the point, and a 2-day gap doesn't undo the neural work you've already done. If you miss 3 or more days in a row, something is interfering that's worth examining. Before you restart, run a 5 whys on the resistance. What's actually making this hard? Is it time? Is it discomfort with what the questions are surfacing? Is the protocol genuinely wrong for your life right now? The answer matters. Don't restart blindly. Understand what interrupted you and address that first. One practical note: missing 2 days because you were traveling, sick, or in crisis is not the same as missing 2 days because the practice felt pointless. Be honest with yourself about which one it is. Daily tracking table: use this table each day. Keep it somewhere visible: a notebook, a notes app, whatever you'll actually use. Day practice done. Key question asked: what it unlocked? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If we're practice done, use a simple notation: A. Audit, B. Breaks check, W. 5 whys, D. Diagnostic swap, U. Unasked question. Mark each one you completed. 5 letters per day. For key question asked, write the single most interesting or uncomfortable question you asked that day. 1 sentence. For what it unlocked, write what changed: a new piece of information, a shift in your thinking, a conversation that went somewhere unexpected, or nothing yet. Nothing yet is honest and fine. Not every question unlocks something immediately. What to expect: the arc of 7 days is not linear improvement. Here is what you will more likely experience: days 1 to 2 feel mechanical and slightly absurd. You're doing the practices because you said you would, not because they feel natural or obviously useful. You'll catch yourself wondering if this is just mindfulness rebranded. You'll audit 3 questions and feel like you're manufacturing analysis. This is fine. The practices are supposed to feel mechanical at first. You're installing new habits into grooves that currently run in entirely different directions. Days 3 to 5 bring a shift from mechanics to noticing. You'll start catching things in real time: a question that you're about to ask that you suddenly recognize as a status question masquerading as concern, a why is this happening, that you realize you've been asking at the wrong level for months, an assumption in someone else's question that you can see clearly even when they can't. The noticing is not comfortable, but it is unmistakably real. You're not manufacturing analysis anymore, you're observing actual patterns. Days 6 to 7 are where you get a first glimpse of clarity. Not a transformation, 1 week doesn't do that, but a genuine small shift in at least one area. One question you're carrying looks different than it did a week ago. One conversation felt more honest. One decision is less murky because you pushed past the surface question to what was actually at stake. What you should not expect: a complete overhaul of how you communicate, sudden radical honesty in every conversation, or the ability to run flawless 5 whys diagnostics every time. That's the 21-day practice, not the 7-day one. This week is about establishing the floor awareness, the breaks habit, and the beginning of your daily drill. Build the floor well. It's what everything else stands on. The 21-day question practice: if you've already done the 7-day reset, or if you came to this chapter because you've already been thinking deliberately about how you ask questions, you know the basics. You know that a question contains a hidden assumption, that status questions are often avoiding the real question, that why, asked more than once, goes somewhere more useful than why, asked once. You've installed the floor. This chapter is about building on it. The 21-day practice is designed for the detail driller and the moderate question avoider. The detail driller, the person who asks precise, intelligent questions but tends to ask them inside a frame that's never examined. You ask the right questions about the wrong problem. The question avoider has the reverse issue: you have a sharp sense of what needs to be asked, but you defer, soften, and redirect around the hardest questions because asking them feels risky. In both cases, the 7-day reset gave you tools. The 21-day practice teaches you to use them at full force in harder contexts, with real stakes, and under the social pressure that makes most people back down. 3 weeks is long enough to go through several complete cycles of a real project or decision. Long enough to try things, fail, notice the failure, and adjust. Long enough to get past the early mechanical phase and into genuine integration. If the 7-day reset was about awareness, the 21-day practice is about fluency. Before you start, what's different about this level? The 6 practices here are identical in form to the 5 from level 1, with one addition. But the standard is higher. At level 1, completing the practice is success. At level 2, completing it at low quality isn't. Let me be specific about what that means. At level 1, the question audit asked you to identify 3 questions and note whether they changed anything. At level 2, the audit asks you to identify not just whether the question changed something, but what assumption the question carried, whether that assumption was sound, and what a better question would have been. The form is the same. The depth is different. At level 1, the 5 whys asked you to run 5 whys once a day. At level 2, you're expected to run it in real conversations, not just in your notebook, and you're expected to push past the polite stopping point, the moment when someone gives you an explanation and the social norm says, that's a good enough answer. At level 2, you stay curious past that moment. The additional practice, the weekly question inventory, introduces a different kind of work, not asking better questions moment to moment, but mapping the full landscape of questions you're currently carrying. Some of those questions need to be decided quickly. Others need to be held open. Some are the wrong question entirely. The inventory teaches you to see all of them at once and sort them by what they actually require from you. The 6 core daily practices: Practice 1, the daily question audit, with depth, same structure as level 1, review 3 questions you asked today. But now ask 3 things about each one. First, what assumption did this question carry? Second, was that assumption examined before you asked, or did you take it for granted? Third, if the assumption is wrong, what would a better version of this question look like? The mechanism is moving from detection to reconstruction. At level 1, you were learning to notice closed questions. At level 2, you're learning to rebuild them. The rebuilt question doesn't have to be asked, it's a diagnostic tool, a way of sharpening your sense of what you were actually trying to understand. Over 3 weeks, you'll build a personal catalog of your question failure modes. Most people have 2 or 3 recurring ones. Recognizing yours is worth the entire practice. Practice 2, the breaks. Check. With stakes, the form is the same. Before any significant question, pause and identify the assumption. But now add a second layer: evaluate the reversibility of what happens if you're wrong. This is the reversibility radar applied to questions themselves. A question that leads you down the wrong path for 5 minutes is a type 2 error, easy to recover from. A question that shapes how a team builds a product for 6 months is a type 1 error, hard to reverse, high cost. The breaks. Check at level 2 asks not just what breaks,
but how hard is it to unbreak? If the answer is very hard, you need to do more work on the assumption before asking. Practically, when you identify a high-stakes assumption, don't just flag it. Take one concrete step to test it before you ask the question you were planning to ask. A quick search, a single sentence to a colleague, a 10-minute reread of something relevant. Test before you commit to the direction the question would take you. Practice 3, the 5 whys in live conversation at level 2. The 5 whys moves out of your notebook and into real interactions. In a meeting, in a conversation with a colleague, in a discussion with someone you're making a decision with, when someone offers an explanation, don't accept it as the bottom. Ask why. When they answer, ask why again. You don't need to say, "I'm doing the 5 whys." You just need to stay curious longer than feels socially comfortable. The mechanism is that root causes are socially inconvenient. They implicate processes, decisions, and people. The polite stopping point, the first or second answer, is usually where everyone in the room is comfortable stopping. Going past it isn't aggressive, it's honest. But it requires that you tolerate the slight awkwardness of asking why one more time than the room expects. One important calibration: the 5 whys is not an interrogation. Your goal is understanding, not exposure. The tone matters enormously. Why did that happen, asked with genuine curiosity, is a collaborative tool. The same question asked with an accusatory edge is an attack. The difference is in what you're actually trying to do, and at level 2, your job is to be genuinely curious about the system, not to assign blame. Practice 4, the diagnostic swap. Every time at level 1, you replaced one status question per meeting. At level 2, you replace every status question you're about to ask, or you replace enough of them that the exception requires a deliberate reason, not a lapse. You should be able to say, when you do ask a status question, "I'm asking for status here because a diagnostic question would be premature/inappropriate/ not what this person needs right now." If you can't say that, you asked the wrong question. The mechanism is the same as level 1, but the standard has shifted from once per meeting to always, with deliberate exceptions. You're building a default, not a rule. Practice 5, the unasked question. With a deadline, the end-of-day practice remains: write the question you haven't asked yet. But at level 2, every unasked question gets a due date. When will you ask it? Not "when I'm ready," that's not a due date, that's an avoidance deferral. A specific date. Within the week if it's genuinely important. Within the 21 days if it's something you need to work up to. The mechanism is converting unasked questions from intentions into commitments. At level 1, naming the question was the practice. At level 2, naming it without committing to ask it is only halfway done. Practice 6, the weekly question inventory. Once a week, Sunday evening or Monday morning, whichever you'll actually do, take 30 minutes to map all the questions you're currently carrying. Not the questions you've already asked and answered. The open questions, the ones you haven't resolved, the ones you're thinking about, the ones you probably need to be thinking about and aren't. Write them down in a list. Then sort them using 2 axes. First, is this a surface question or a root question? A surface question is at the symptom level: what should I do about this situation? A root question is at the cause level: what's actually happening here, and why? If you have a lot of surface questions and few root questions, your inventory has a structural problem. You're carrying a lot of questions that are probably the wrong questions. Second, apply the reversibility radar. For each question, mark it type 1, the consequences of getting this wrong are hard to reverse, take your time, think carefully, or type 2, the consequences of getting this wrong are easy to reverse, decide quickly, move forward. Many people spend enormous cognitive energy on type 2 questions because they feel urgent. The inventory helps you see that clearly, and reallocate your attention to the questions that actually warrant it. The 3-week structure. Week 1 Foundation. The first week is about establishing the habit under real-world conditions. Real-world conditions include busy days where you forget entirely, moments where you're tempted to skip the breaks, check because the decision feels obvious, meetings where everyone is moving fast and asking a diagnostic question feels like slowing the group down. Your job in week 1 is not to execute perfectly. It's to execute consistently enough that you're building the daily groove of the 6 practices. The question inventory at the end of week 1 should be a discovery experience. You'll likely find that you're carrying more open questions than you realized, and that many of them have been surface questions for a long time without anyone pushing them to root level.
Week 1 is also about noticing your default question patterns. Everyone has them.
Detail drillers tend to ask technically precise questions inside an unexamined frame, excellent questions about implementation when the real question should be about whether to implement it all. Question avoiders tend to ask questions that are close to the real thing but slightly deflected. How do you feel about the project, rather than, are you actually committed to this? Notice your pattern this week. Write it down explicitly. The rest of the 3 weeks will be oriented toward interrupting it. Week 2, deepening. In the second week, you take the practices into harder contexts. Specifically, high-stakes conversations in team environments. High-stakes conversations are the ones where you most want to ask safe questions. A performance conversation with someone you manage. A difficult talk with a partner. A negotiation. An honest conversation with a mentor about whether you're on the right path. These are the conversations where the pull toward comfortable, closed questions is strongest, because the stakes of asking the real question feel high. The breaks check is most valuable here. Before the conversation, identify the 2 or 3 most important questions you're planning to ask. For each one, run the assumption check. What are you taking for granted about what the other person thinks, feels, or knows? What would break if that's wrong? This pre-work takes 15 minutes and dramatically changes the quality of the conversation. In team environments, the additional challenge is social. Asking diagnostic questions when everyone else is comfortable with status questions makes you the person slowing things down. You'll get eye rolls. You'll hear, "We can take that offline." You'll be told you're overthinking it. This is where the practice earns its difficulty. The right response is not to become aggressive or to double down in an adversarial way, it's to ask the question calmly and simply, without apologizing for asking it, and to be genuinely interested in the answer rather than interested in being right. By the end of week 2, the practices should feel less like things you're doing and more like lenses you're looking through. Week 3, integration. In week 3, you apply everything to one real project or decision. Pick something with actual stakes, not a toy problem, not a hypothetical. A project you're actively working on. A decision you actually need to make. A relationship dynamic you've been navigating. Use the question inventory to map all the open questions around this project. Sort by surface/root and by reversibility. Then identify the single most important unanswered question, the one that, if you got the answer wrong, would send you in the wrong direction on everything else. This is your shape-up moment. Before building anything, what do you need to understand? What is the question that needs to be answered before any other question makes sense? Spend the 3rd week oriented around that question. Use the 5 whys to drill into it. Use the breaks check to pressure test your assumptions. Use your diagnostic questions to get honest input from the people who know the relevant parts you don't. Let the question do real work. By the end of week 3, you should be able to say, "I asked a different question than I would have 3 weeks ago, and it led me somewhere I wouldn't have otherwise gone." That's integration. That's the practice working. Navigating pushback. When you start asking better questions, some people find it irritating. A colleague says you're always overthinking. A family member complains that you turn every conversation into an interrogation. A manager tells you to just get to the point. This is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. First, check whether the feedback has merit. Are you asking questions as a way of avoiding decisions? Are you running 5 whys in situations where the person just needs a simple answer? Are you treating a type 2 decision as if it's type 1 and holding everyone up? The criticism might be right. Take it as data, not as an attack. If you've checked and the feedback doesn't have merit, if you're asking diagnostic questions in contexts where they genuinely matter, and people are resisting because it's uncomfortable, then the resistance itself is information. It tells you something about the culture around you and what it protects. A culture that resists diagnostic questions is usually protecting assumptions that don't want to be examined. The right response to this kind of resistance is not to stop asking. It's to be more careful about how you ask. I want to make sure I understand this before we decide lands differently that I'm not sure we're asking the right question.
The first is collaborative. The second sounds like criticism even when it isn't.
Same question, different framing, dramatically different reception.
One thing you don't have to do: justify your questions constantly. You don't owe an explanation every time you ask something that goes deeper than the room is used to.
Ask clearly, listen genuinely, and let the answer do the work of explaining why the question mattered. Weekly thought record template at the end of each week. Fill in this table for 5 questions from the week that felt significant either because they worked well or because they didn't. Question asked, type, surface/root, what it assumed, better version, for, what it assumed, be specific.
Don't write I assumed everything was fine. Write the actual assumed claim embedded in the question.
If you asked which of these 2 options should we choose, the assumption is that the right answer is one of the 2 options you've identified.
Maybe it is. Maybe there's a third option you haven't generated yet.
For better version, write the question you should have asked, not a fantasy version that requires information you didn't have, but a question you could have asked with what you knew at the time. Weekly check-in table week biggest wrong question, biggest right question, pattern noticed, 1, 2, 3, biggest wrong question means the question that most clearly took you in the wrong direction, confirmed a false assumption, or avoided what actually needed to be addressed. Biggest right question means the question that opened something up, that changed your thinking, that produced information you didn't expect, that moved something forward that had been stuck. Pattern noticed means what you see across the week as a whole. Not the individual questions but the tendency. Are you still deferring the hardest questions? Are you asking root questions in your notebook but surface questions in conversations? Is your 5 whys consistently stopping at level 2 or 3? Name the pattern. That's the thing to work on in the following week. What to expect: the emotional and cognitive arc of 3 weeks is more complex than the arc of 1 week. Here is an honest account of it. Week 1 feels like expanded level 1, familiar discomfort, mechanical execution, occasional moments of genuine noticing. The question inventory at the end of week 1 is usually the first genuinely surprising experience. Most people find they're carrying far more unresolved questions than they knew, and that those questions have been sitting at the surface level for a long time. That surprise is the beginning of something real. Week 2 brings a specific kind of discomfort that level 1 doesn't have: social friction. This is the week when the practices collide with other people. You'll run the 5 whys in a meeting and get a look. You'll ask a diagnostic question and get a summary report instead of an answer. You'll have a high-stakes conversation and feel the pull to ask the safe question rather than the real one. This is not a sign that the practice is going wrong. It's the friction you came here to learn to tolerate. Lean into it gently. You don't have to be aggressive. You just have to be honest. Week 3 is where the practice stops being a practice and starts being a tool. This is the week when something will click, not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet reorientation. You'll be working on something real, and you'll ask a question, and the answer will be unexpected, and you'll realize that the unexpected answer is the important one, the one that changes what you do next. That moment is the whole point. It doesn't happen on schedule. For some people it's day 16. For some it's day 21. For a few it's day 23, after the formal practice ends. But it happens, and when it does, it makes the prior 3 weeks feel like a very reasonable investment. What you should not expect at the end of 3 weeks: perfection, a complete elimination of your old question habits, or the ability to ask the right question every time in every situation. Your default patterns have been running for years. 3 weeks shifts them, it doesn't replace them. What you'll have at the end is a genuine alternative available to you, a practiced reflex toward root questions, and a clearer sense of when your questions are serving you and when they're not. That's enough. From that foundation, the practice isn't a program you do for 3 weeks. It's a capacity you've built, and you carry it with you. Level 3, the 30-day question architecture. There are people for whom the 2-week resets in the previous chapters are enough. They hit a rough patch, they notice their questions have gone shallow, they run the protocol, and they come out the other side thinking more clearly. That's good. That's the system working. Then there are people for whom the problem runs deeper. If you've spent years asking questions designed to confirm rather than discover, or if you've built an entire professional identity around having answers rather than asking better ones, a 2-week reset will feel like trying to renovate a building while still living in it. You can make the rooms nicer, but the load-bearing walls are still in the wrong places. Level 3 is for you if you're in a major transition, a career change, a relationship reckoning, a business pivot that has failed once already, a life stage where the questions you used to ask simply don't work anymore. It's also for what I call the chronic question avoider, the person who has learned, somewhere along the way, that not asking is safer than asking wrong.
If that's you, you know it. You make decisions by momentum.
You mistake silence for peace.
You confuse the absence of hard questions with the absence of hard problems. The question avoider is not lazy.
That's the misconception most people have about themselves when they recognize this pattern. Avoidance is usually a very sophisticated intelligence protecting itself from outcomes it has learned to fear, the discovery that you've been wrong about something important, the discomfort of not knowing what comes next, the social exposure of asking something that reveals how uncertain you actually are. The avoidance isn't a failure of intelligence. It's intelligence misdirected.
Level 3 is about redirecting it.
One note before we go further: if your question avoidance is bound up with clinical anxiety, persistent low-grade dread, or a sense that asking questions about your own life feels genuinely dangerous, please bring a therapist into this alongside you. The protocol here is not a substitute for that kind of support. Done together, they're more powerful.
Done alone, the protocol can sometimes surface things that need more than a notebook in 30 days.
The 8 core daily practices these build on the practices from Level 2, but they've been upgraded for depth.
Think of Level 2 as learning to drive. Level 3 is learning to read the road itself. 1. The stakes question, upgraded from what breaks. Each morning, before you plan your day, ask, what is the most important thing I could be wrong about right now?
Not just in the next hour, in your work, in your relationships, in the story you're telling yourself about where your life is headed.
Write one answer down. Don't solve it. Just name it.
2. The reversibility audit, upgraded from the radar. Each evening, review the 3 most significant decisions you either made or avoided that day. For each one, classify it: Type 1, hard to reverse, needs deliberate questioning, or Type 2, easy to reverse, safe to act quickly. The upgrade is this: for every Type 1 decision you made that day, ask whether you treated it like a Type 1 or rushed it like a Type 2.
Most mistakes aren't from moving slowly on Type 2s. They're from moving fast on Type 1s while telling yourself it's reversible. 3. 5 whys on friction. Anytime you notice friction, a conversation that went sideways, a task that stalled, a plan that feels vaguely wrong, run a full 5 whys before you do anything else. Not a half-hearted 2 whys and then action.
5.
The 5th why is almost never what you thought the problem was. 4. The assumption log. Keep a running list of the assumptions currently holding up your most important projects and relationships. Not all assumptions, just the ones that, if wrong, would require you to rebuild something. Review this list every 3 days. The practice isn't to challenge every assumption. It's to know which ones you're betting on, and to know it consciously. 5. Appetite. Overestimate. Before you start any significant piece of work, do not ask, how long will this take? Ask, how much of my attention and time is this worth? This is the shape-up move, fixing the time, making the scope variable. When you lead with appetite, you force the question of what's actually essential and what's comfort or habit dressed as necessity. 6. The question behind the question. Once a day, in at least one conversation that matters, catch yourself before you ask the first question that comes to mind. Pause. Ask, is this the question I actually need answered, or is it the question that makes me comfortable? Then ask the one you actually need. 7. Question mapping. For any significant decision, one that involves other people, meaningful resources, or a change that's difficult to reverse, draw a question tree before you act. Start with the surface question. Branch into the sub-questions it implies. Keep branching until you hit root questions, the ones where the answers come from your values, not your circumstances.
This practice takes 20 to 40 minutes when done seriously, and it consistently reveals that the question you started with was 2 or 3 levels above the one that actually needed answering. 8. The dead question burial. Once a week, on the same day, sit down with the questions you've been carrying. Write them out. Then ask, for each one, is this question still alive? Does it still point towards something I can act on or learn from? Or am I carrying it out of habit, guilt, anxiety, or the fear that letting it go means something about me? Some questions deserve to die. Why did that relationship fail? Can be a living question that teaches you something, or it can be a dead question that you've already answered but won't stop asking because the asking feels like loyalty to the pain. The dead question burial is not about forgetting. It's about choosing what you carry. The 4-week structure. Week 1, withdrawal. The first week is uncomfortable, and it's supposed to be. You're breaking default question patterns that have been running on autopilot, possibly for years. The discomfort has a specific texture. You'll find yourself reaching for questions that feel comfortable and familiar, and you'll notice, maybe for the first time, that they're not actually useful. A status question sounds like, how is the project going? A diagnostic question sounds like, what's the thing on this project that nobody wants to say out loud? The status question is comfortable. The diagnostic one requires courage. In week 1, you'll feel the gap between those two things more sharply than you ever have. You may also experience what I call question fog, a period where you've dismantled the old habit but the new one isn't solid yet, so you just feel vaguely disoriented about what to ask in any given situation. This is normal. It means the work is happening. Sit in the fog. Don't rush to resolve it by retreating to old patterns. Your one goal for week 1, complete all 8 daily practices every day, even badly. Especially badly. Imperfect execution at this stage is 10 times more valuable than skipping because you don't feel ready. One useful frame for week 1 is this: you're not trying to ask better questions yet. You're trying to notice which questions you default to. That's the whole assignment. Noticing is not a small thing. Most people have never paid attention to the shape of their own questioning, whether they lead with blame or curiosity, whether they ask about systems or individuals, whether their questions point toward what's possible or what went wrong. Week 1 is the inventory before the renovation. Week 2, fog lifting. Somewhere around day 9 or 10, something starts to shift. The practices are becoming slightly more automatic. You catch yourself asking the question behind the question in a meeting without having to remind yourself. You run a 5 whys on a piece of friction and get to the 3rd why faster than last week. The fog doesn't lift all at once. It lifts in patches. You'll have a conversation where you ask exactly the right question at the right moment, and the other person will pause and say, "That's a really good question," and you'll feel the difference between a question that opens something and a question that closes it. Week 2 is also when your question map practice starts to pay off. You'll map a decision you've been sitting on, and you'll realize that what you thought was a hard decision was actually a hard question, and that you'd been avoiding the question by dressing it up as a decision that wasn't yet ready to be made. Your one goal for week 2, complete at least one full question map on a real decision in your life. Not a practice decision. A real one. A note on resistance: week 2 is also when the internal negotiator shows up. This is the part of you that will argue, credibly, that the question map takes too long, that the 5 whys is excessive for whatever friction you're currently facing, that you've got it from here and can ease off the practices. This negotiator is not malicious. It's your existing patterns trying to reassert themselves now that the first week novelty has worn off. You don't need to defeat it. You just need to recognize it for what it is, and then do the practice anyway. Week 3, rebuild. This is the week where you take the full system into the field. You apply all 8 practices not as exercises but as tools in actual domains: a live work project, a real relationship, a personal decision you've been deferring. The instruction for week 3 is to pick 3 domains, 1 professional, 1 relational, 1 personal, and for each one, run the complete toolkit. Use the stakes question to find what you might be most wrong about. Use the reversibility radar to sort your pending decisions. Run 5 whys on the friction. Map the question tree on the one decision that has the most writing on it. By the end of week 3, most people find that one of 3 things happens. In the best case, a problem they'd been wrestling with for weeks or months resolves cleanly, not because the system gave them an answer, but because better questions revealed what they already knew. In the common case, they realized the problem they were working on was not the actual problem. In the difficult case, they find that a question they'd been avoiding is unavoidable, and they have to decide whether to sit with it or act on it. All three outcomes are progress. What would not be progress is a week in which you applied the tools to safe, low-stakes, already resolved situations and called it done. Week 3 only works if you bring it into real territory, the life project that's actually under pressure, the relationship with actual friction, the decision that has actual consequences. That's not designed to make you uncomfortable. It's designed to make the tools useful rather than theoretical. Week 4 New architecture. By week 4, something has changed that is harder to articulate. The questions you carry daily are different. Not better in a self-congratulatory way, different in character. They tend to be more honest, more specific, and more comfortable sitting unanswered for a while. The goal in week 4 is to become conscious of what is shifted. On day 25, write down the questions you're currently carrying, the real ones, not the comfortable ones. Compare them to the questions you were carrying on day 1. The distance between those two lists is a measure of the architecture you've built. Week 4 is also when the practices start to require less effort. Not no effort, but less. The reversibility radar runs almost automatically when a decision presents itself. The dead question burial feels like maintenance rather than excavation. The most significant thing to notice in week 4 is not the quality of the questions you're asking. It's the quality of the questions you're not asking. You'll find certain categories of anxious, circular, unanswerable questions simply absent from your daily thinking, not because you suppress them, but because you've replaced them with questions that are actually tractable. This is what architectural change feels like. Not dramatic. Quiet. Present in the negative space of what's no longer there. The emergency protocol. At some point during the 30 days, or after them, a high-stakes situation will arrive that doesn't give you time to map question trees or run a proper 5 whys. A deal goes sideways. A relationship crisis lands without warning. A technical system fails in production and decisions need to be made in the next 30 minutes. When this happens, use this 5-step rapid process. Step 1, stop the first question. Whatever your first question is, hold it for 10 seconds. Ask, is this question aimed at understanding the situation, or at confirming what I already think is happening? Step 2, run the stakes check. Ask, what breaks if I'm wrong about my current read of this situation? Name one thing. If you can't name it, you don't understand the situation well enough to act yet. Step 3, classify the decision. Type 1 or Type 2. If the decision you're about to make is hard to reverse, slow down by 30 seconds even if the room is on fire. If it's easy to reverse, move quickly. Step 4, ask the diagnostic question. Not what do we do, but what is actually happening here? One sentence. Out loud if possible. Step 5, act on the question's answer, not on the pressure. Pressure has its own gravity. It pulls you toward the decision that relieves the feeling of pressure, not the decision that actually addresses the problem. The practice of asking the diagnostic question even once, even quickly, is the difference between those two things. This 5-step process takes under 2 minutes when practiced. And like all emergency protocols, it works best if you've rehearsed it when the stakes are low. Social and work navigation. Somewhere in the 30 days, you'll be in a meeting or a conversation where your new questioning habits will be visible to other people. You'll ask the question behind the question out loud. You'll say, I want to map this before we decide, when everyone else is ready to move. You'll run a 5 whys in a context where people expected a quick answer. Some people will find this valuable. Others will find it precious, slow, or pretentious. Here's how to navigate it without either abandoning your practice or annoying everyone you work with. First, don't narrate the method. If you're running a 5 whys in your head, you don't need to say, I'm now going to apply the 5 whys framework. Just ask the question. The method is not interesting to anyone who isn't reading this book. The question is. Second, lead with appetite, not process.
Instead of, I think we need to slow down and really interrogate our assumptions here, say before we scope this, what's the most important thing we'd need to be right about for this to work? Same intent. Shorter. More likely to land. Third, give the group somewhere to go. The social friction of better questions comes mostly from asking them without offering a path forward. If you ask the question that stops the room, also offer the next move. Good, so before we decide, can we spend 5 minutes on that? I have a thought. Finally, you don't need to explain your practice to anyone. The outcomes will speak. The questions that open things, the decisions that hold up, the problems that don't recur, these are more persuasive than any explanation of the methodology. There is also a version of this navigation issue that goes in the other direction: colleagues or partners who notice you're operating differently and want to understand it. In that case, share the tools without the theory. I find it helps to ask what we'd need to be right about for this to work is a complete transmission. You don't need to teach the book. You just need to ask the question, and let the question demonstrate its own value. What to expect here is the honest 30-day arc. Days 1 to 7 are uncomfortable in a specific way. You feel more uncertain than you did before you started. This is not a sign that the practice isn't working. It's a sign that the false certainty you were operating from is becoming visible. Days 10 to 14 are the low point for almost everyone who completes this protocol. The old patterns have been disrupted. The new architecture isn't solid yet. You'll feel like your thinking is worse than it was before you started. Some people quit here. Don't quit here. The low at days 10 to 14 is the lag between dismantling what wasn't working and integrating what does. Days 18 to 22 are when the shift happens. It doesn't announce itself. You'll notice it in retrospect: a conversation that went better than it would have 6 months ago, a decision you made that you're not second-guessing, a question you asked yourself that you immediately knew was the right one. The shift is quiet, which is what makes it durable. By day 30, the practices aren't finished, they become a foundation. The goal was never to complete 30 days and then stop. The goal was to build an architecture that runs underneath everything else: the way you approach decisions, the way you enter difficult conversations, the way you shape problems before you try to solve them. Integration doesn't feel like achievement. It feels like clarity you're not yet sure how to account for. You'll ask a better question, get a better answer, and notice, without celebration, just noticing, that this is different from how you used to move through things. That noticing is the architecture. It took 30 days to build. It will take a lifetime to use well. One last thing. Some people complete day 30 and feel that nothing has changed, and they're disappointed. If this happens to you, I want to offer a reframe. The 30 days did not produce a transformation you can feel as a single event, because transformation in how you think almost never announces itself. What it produces is a subtle but durable shift in the questions that arise first when you encounter a situation. That shift is small in the moment and enormous over time. You won't feel it on day 30. You'll feel it on day 90, when you look back and realize you've been operating differently for 3 months without noticing the seam. That is what integration looks like. It looks like nothing happened. What actually happened is that it became normal. Sustaining the questioning mind, finishing a reset protocol, whether it was the 2-week level 1, the extended level 2, or the full 30-day level 3 architecture, is not the end of anything. It's the beginning of the maintenance problem, which is different from the original problem but no less real. The original problem was that you were asking the wrong questions, or too few, or none at all. The maintenance problem is this: the conditions that made bad questioning easy will return. Pressure returns. Comfort returns. The gravitational pull of familiar patterns returns. And it returns without announcing itself. Most people who do serious work on how they think and ask eventually relapse. That's not a judgment, it's a structural fact about how habits work. The question isn't whether you'll drift. It's whether you'll recognize it early enough to correct before the drift becomes a direction. This chapter is about staying oriented. It's not about being perfect. There is no version of this practice where you maintain green zone indefinitely without effort, and the attempt to maintain it through sheer willpower, without structures and checkpoints, is one of the most reliable routes back to red.
What you're building here is not a state of perpetual clarity.
It's a system that makes drift visible and correction cheap.
The 3 zones. The simplest map for long-term maintenance is a color system. It won't tell you everything, but it will tell you enough. Green zone, you're asking diagnostic questions by default. When you encounter friction, your first move is 5 whys, not action. You catch your own assumptions before they harden into facts. The 3 mental models, what breaks, reversibility radar, 5 whys, are running in the background of most significant decisions without conscious effort. You're comfortable not knowing the answer to a question you've just asked, because the question itself is doing useful work.
Yellow zone, you're reverting to status questions under stress.
You're skipping the 5th why and settling for the 3rd. You're avoiding the hard question in at least one area of your life, maybe the work situation that's making you anxious, maybe the conversation you've been putting off, maybe the assumption at the center of a project that you haven't wanted to examine too closely.
Yellow is not a crisis. Yellow is a weather warning.
Red zone, you're making significant decisions without questioning them.
You're actively confirming what you already believe rather than testing it.
The questions you're asking are designed to produce comfort, not clarity. At the extreme end of red, you've stopped distinguishing between this decision is settled and I've decided not to question this decision.
Those are different things. In red zone, they feel the same. The important thing to understand about these zones is that you can move between them in a single week, sometimes in a single day.
A high-stakes conversation can pull you from green to yellow before lunch.
A week of sustained pressure can pull you from yellow to red by Friday. This is normal. What isn't sustainable is staying in red and not noticing. The zones are also not uniform across your life.
You can be solidly green in your professional work and deep red in a particular relationship. You can be green in your personal decisions and yellow in how you engage with your team. Zone assessment is not a global score, it's a diagnostic map, and some areas of the map will always be more developed than others. What the map tells you is where to direct your attention, not how to grade your overall performance.
The 4-stage relapse pattern. Relapse into bad questioning follows a recognizable pattern. Once you can see the pattern, you can interrupt it much earlier.
Stage 1, stress spikes, questions get shorter.
This is subtle and almost always feels justified.
You're busy. The situation is urgent.
There isn't time for the full process. The questions you ask become more compressed. Are we on track? Instead of what's the thing on this project that we haven't said out loud yet? This compression feels efficient.
It is not efficient. It is the first concession.
Stage 2, short questions multiply assumptions.
When you're asking shorter questions, you're leaving more of the situation unexamined. The unexamined parts don't disappear, they become assumptions.
We're probably aligned on priorities. She probably understood what I meant.
That risk is probably manageable.
Probably is the word that assumptions hide behind.
At stage 2, your decision-making environment is filling up with probablys that you're treating as certainties.
Stage 3, assumptions accumulate wrong decisions. The wrong decisions at this stage aren't dramatic.
They're the small kind, the feature built in the wrong direction, the conversation that went sideways because you assumed shared context that didn't exist, the plan that collapsed because a foundational assumption was never tested.
Each wrong decision, on its own, is recoverable.
The accumulation is the problem. Accumulated wrong decisions create a workload of correction that makes it even harder to slow down and ask better questions.
Stage 4, wrong decisions collapse confidence in questioning. This is the darkest stage, and the most insidious.
You did the work. You built the practice. And now you're in the middle of a pile of decisions that didn't hold up, and it feels like the questioning practice didn't protect you.
The conclusion that wants to form is, it doesn't work.
The actual explanation is, you stopped doing it 2 stages ago, and the damage compounded.
But stage 4 doesn't feel that way. It feels like evidence against the system.
If you can catch stage 1, you never reach stage 4.
If you catch stage 2, you might need a week of deliberate practice to reorient.
If you're already at stage 3, run a level 1 reset.
If you're at stage 4, go back to level 3.
The pattern also has a speed. It moves faster under certain conditions, specifically the trigger seasons described later in this chapter. Knowing that the pattern accelerates in those seasons means you can intervene earlier, before it reaches the stages where the intervention is costly. The 333 check below is specifically designed as a Stage 1 and Stage 2 detector. Run it monthly, and you'll rarely need to run a full reset. The monthly 333 check once a month, on a day you choose and keep, run the 333 check. It takes about 20 minutes. It takes less time than recovering from a month spent in yellow zone. The check has 3 categories, 3 questions each. Questions about your questioning habits. 1. In the last month, which important question did I avoid asking? 2. Where in my life am I asking status questions when I need diagnostic ones? 3. What decision did I make last month that I rushed because I was uncomfortable with the uncertainty of slowing down? Questions about your current assumptions. 1. What is the most important thing I'm currently assuming without evidence? 2. What would I need to observe or learn to know whether that assumption is right? 3. If my most load-bearing assumption is wrong, what breaks? Questions about what I'm not asking. 1. What area of my life has the most unanswered questions that I'm treating as settled? 2. What's the question I'm most afraid to ask myself right now? 3. Who in my life would ask me a better question about this than I'm asking myself? These 9 questions are not the same as your daily practices. They're diagnostic, they give you a read on your zone and a map of where the drift has been. You don't need to answer them all fully in one sitting. You need to answer them honestly. The third category, what you're not asking, is consistently the hardest and the most valuable. The questions you're not asking are invisible by definition. You have to approach them indirectly, by looking at where you have a lot of certainty, where a conversation has gone unusually flat, where a plan has an unusual amount of momentum without scrutiny. The absence of a question is always a signal about something. The 333 check trains you to read that signal. Trigger seasons. There are predictable times when questioning degrades. Knowing them in advance is a significant advantage. High-pressure sprints are the most common trigger. When a deadline is close, when the output is high stakes, when the pressure is visible and immediate, this is when the internal argument for skipping the practice sounds most reasonable. There isn't time. There is always time for one diagnostic question. What there often isn't is the willingness to hear an answer that would complicate the sprint. That's the real reason the questions get skipped. Relationship conflict degrades questioning in a particular way. You stop asking open questions about the other person's perspective and start asking closed questions designed to confirm that you're right. The 5 whys, applied honestly to a conflict, will frequently reveal that you're at least partially wrong. Under conflict pressure, that discovery is unwelcome. So the 5 whys get skipped. The conflict continues. Personal loss, a death, a breakup, a failure that stings, disrupts questioning because some questions become too dangerous to ask. Did I do enough? Could I have prevented this? What does this mean about the direction I've been heading? These are live questions that genuinely need time before they can be asked without destruction. Give them time. But don't let the protection of "I'm not ready to ask" that become a permanent posture. Grief and processing are real. Indefinite avoidance dressed as grief is different. New jobs and new environments create a specific questioning failure, the pressure to perform competence before you've earned context. In a new role, you don't ask the naive questions because you don't want to look naive. This is backwards. The naive questions in week 2 of a new job are the most valuable questions you will ever have access to in that organization. Ask them while you still can. The window closes faster than you think. There is also a category of trigger that doesn't fit neatly into the list above: success. This is counterintuitive, but it's real. When something works, a project lands, a relationship deepens, a decision pays off cleanly, the questioning instinct can quiet down because there's no apparent friction to investigate. Success is a soft yellow trigger. The practices feel less necessary, so they get practiced less, so the architecture softens around the edges. The point isn't to question your successes destructively. It's to stay curious inside them. What worked here, and why,
and would it work in a different context, is a question worth asking especially when everything seems fine. In each of these trigger seasons, the intervention is the same. Notice the zone you're in. Name it. And if you're in yellow, run the 333 before the month is out. Environmental design. The practice doesn't live entirely in your head. It lives in the structures you build around yourself, the physical environment, the digital environment, and the social environment. All three matter. Physical environment: keep a dedicated notebook for questions, not notes. The distinction is important. Notes record what is. Question notebooks record what's unresolved, uncertain, in need of investigation. A whiteboard in your workspace with one active question on it, the most important question you're currently working on, changes what you think about between meetings. It also signals to the people you work with what kind of thinking you're doing. Digital environment: keep question templates you can pull up quickly, for one-on-ones, for project kickoffs, for retrospectives, for personal decisions. These aren't scripts. They're starting points. What's the thing we haven't said yet, written at the top of a meeting agenda, changes the meeting. What are we assuming that we haven't tested, written at the top of a project brief, changes the brief. The friction of good questioning is mostly the friction of remembering to do it. Templates remove that friction. Social environment: the most powerful environmental variable is whether the people around you ask good questions. If you work in a culture where status questions dominate, where "how's it going" is the ceiling, you will need more internal discipline to maintain your practice than someone who works with people who naturally go deeper. You can accelerate this by finding one accountability partner, someone who agrees to call you on status questions, who will ask, "Is that the real question?" when you're circling. The relationship doesn't need to be formal. It needs to be honest. Consider what your team's questioning norms actually are. Not the aspirational norms, the actual ones. Are retrospectives genuine diagnostic sessions, or are they status reporting dressed up as reflection? Are questions in meetings welcomed, or are they treated as obstacles to decisions that have already been made? You probably can't change an organization's culture alone. But you can model the behavior, and models are more persuasive than manifestos. One practical move: if you run meetings, write one question on the agenda that you genuinely don't know the answer to. Not a rhetorical question. A real one. Something that depends on the room. What's the thing about this project that's making us all slightly nervous, or what would we do if we had half the time we're planning on? These questions change the texture of meetings, gradually, and they change it without requiring any announcement that you're doing something different. The meeting shapes differently because the agenda shapes differently. That is environmental design in practice. The annual reset: once a year, run a full reset at whatever level feels appropriate. The signal that you need a reset is not failure. The signal is drift you haven't corrected for more than a month. Most people who do this work seriously will need a level 1 reset once or twice a year, a 2-week return to basics when the practices have gone automatic in the wrong direction. Some will need a level 2 or 3 reset every few years, particularly at major life transitions. Think of the annual reset less like repair and more like calibration. The questions you were asking in January may not be the right questions in December, not because you've done something wrong, but because your life has changed and the old questions don't fit the new shape of things. One of the less discussed benefits of a reset is that it surfaces which questions have become irrelevant, which ones have been answered and can be retired, and which new ones have been waiting for you to notice them. The annual reset is also a ritual. Rituals matter. They create moments of deliberate reflection in a life that moves fast enough to swallow deliberate reflection without noticing. When you do your annual reset, pay attention to which practices feel rusty versus which ones have become genuinely automatic. Rusty practices need rebuilding. Automatic practices might need examining, because a practice that runs entirely without thought can also run without accuracy. The reversibility radar is only useful if you're actually classifying decisions correctly, not just running the classification habit on autopilot and reaching for type 2 whenever you want to move fast. An annual reset is a chance to verify that your automatic practices are still accurate, not just fast. What to expect at 6 months of sustained practice? A few things will be noticeably different. You'll find that you're less surprised by problems, not because you've become pessimistic,
but because better questions surface problems earlier, when they're still easy to address. You'll find that some of your most important relationships have gotten more honest, because you've been asking more honest questions in them. You'll find that you make fewer decisions you regret, not zero, but fewer, and that the ones you do regret are the ones where you knew the right question and chose not to ask it. At 1 year, something subtler happens. The practice becomes part of how you understand yourself. You'll notice when you're avoiding a question not through a formal audit but through a kind of felt sense, a background discomfort that you've learned to recognize as a signal rather than dismiss as noise. The 3 mental models will run without being invoked. What breaks? Type 1 or Type 2? Why and then why again? These will be moves you make the way an experienced driver makes gear changes, without thinking about them and because of years of thinking about them. There will also be what I call the long gift of this practice. The questions you're asked by other people will start to feel different to you. You'll feel, almost immediately, whether a question is diagnostic or performative, whether it's designed to open something or close it. This is not about judgment. It's about attunement. You'll be better at helping other people find their better questions, not by lecturing them about the method, but by modeling it. Sustaining the questioning mind is not about reaching a final state where you always ask the right question. Nobody reaches that state. It's about building the architecture that makes the right question more likely, and the discipline to maintain that architecture especially when everything in you wants to skip it and just act. At 1 year, there's one more thing worth knowing. The practice will have made you slightly less impressive in certain social contexts and considerably more effective in the ones that matter. The person who always has an immediate confident answer reads well in meetings. But over the span of years, the person who pauses, names what they don't know, and asks the question underneath the question produces better decisions, better teams, and fewer expensive corrections. The lag between those two profiles is about 18 months. After that, the gap is unmistakable. That's the practice. It doesn't end. It just gets quieter, more natural, and more yours. The question that's already forming: picture someone, you can make them anyone, or make them you, sitting at a desk before a meeting. There are 2 minutes left. They have a message drafted and haven't sent it yet, and they're reading it back one more time. Not for typos. For something else. They're noticing that there's a question forming at the edge of their thinking. Not the question the message asks, that one is easy, practical, already written. A different one, underneath it: is this actually what I need to know? 2 years ago, this person wouldn't have paused. They would have sent the message, received the answer to the question they'd asked, and moved forward. The forward movement would have felt like progress. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was just motion dressed as progress, the comforting sensation of things happening while the actual question went unasked. They sit with it for a moment. They revise one line. They send a different message, one that asks closer to the real thing. This is the whole book, in 2 minutes. What changed is not that you know more answers. If anything, a serious engagement with better questions leaves you with fewer answers, at least initially, because better questions reveal how much you had been mistaking assumption for knowledge, and momentum for decision, and avoiding for deciding. The edifice of false certainty has to come down before anything sturdier can go up. What changed is that you've learned to sit with better questions. And that is a different kind of competence than knowing things. It's older, quieter, and harder to fake. There's a paradox at the center of this practice that becomes visible only after you've been inside it for a while. The more skilled your questions become, the more comfortable you become with not knowing. This sounds backwards. Shouldn't better questions produce better answers, faster? Sometimes they do. But more often, a genuinely good question reveals the depth of something rather than producing a quick resolution, and a person who has learned to ask well has also learned that the depth is valuable in itself. The question is not just a vehicle to an answer. It is a way of being present to a situation. There's something almost counterintuitive about this comfort with not knowing. It doesn't feel like uncertainty anymore. It feels like accuracy. You're no longer pretending to know things you don't know, and the freedom of that, once you've tasted it, is difficult to give up. The discomfort of not knowing is only unbearable when you're fighting it. When you've learned to carry it well, the same sensation becomes something more like the feeling of being at the edge of something interesting.
The questions that satisfy most aren't the ones that close.
They're the ones that open correctly, that carve the problem along its actual grain rather than across it, the way a good knife follows the structure of what it's cutting. You know you've asked the right question not just because the answer turns out to be useful, but because everything becomes slightly clearer the moment the question lands.
Don Norman spent a career studying why things go wrong between people and the objects they use.
His conclusion, patiently demonstrated across hundreds of examples, was that failures are almost never the user's fault, they're design failures. Doors that don't tell you whether to push or pull. Switches that don't correspond to the lights they control. Systems that give no feedback about whether they've understood you.
The poorly designed question works the same way.
It looks like it's asking for information, but its design guarantees a particular kind of response, a surface answer, a reassuring answer, an answer that confirms rather than reveals. The question that asks, "Are we on track?" has a design flaw built into it. The social and professional cost of saying no is high, so the design produces yes far more reliably than it produces the truth.
It looks like communication. It functions like a mirror. The well-designed question,
like the well-designed object, makes the right action obvious.
It creates an environment where the honest answer is the natural answer. It affords clarity rather than demanding it against resistance. This is not just a nice philosophical point.
It is the practical difference between a team that surfaces problems early, when they're cheap to fix, and a team that discovers them late, when they're expensive and occasionally fatal. Learning to ask well is, in part, a design practice. And like all design, it requires knowing your user, in this case, the person or situation you're asking into, and understanding what kind of space the question creates for them.
A question that's too blunt closes people down.
A question that's too soft lets them stay comfortable.
The well-calibrated question finds the opening, honest enough to invite a real answer, safe enough that the real answer can actually be given.
Ryan Singer's idea in Shape Up is deceptively simple: you don't build until you've shaped. You don't commit resources until you've found the form.
And the form is not the solution, it's the bounded problem, with its risks surfaced, its unknowns named, its scope fixed to an appetite rather than padded to a false estimate. Shaping is the work that makes the building possible.
The same discipline applies to questions. A question deployed without shaping, without knowing whether it's actually asking what you need to know, without testing its assumptions, without understanding what breaks if the question itself is wrong, is a question that will consume resources without producing clarity. It will generate answers to the question you asked, not the question you needed.
Shaping a question before you ask it is not slowness.
It is the efficiency that comes from not having to rebuild what you built in the wrong direction. It is the economy of going right rather than going fast. And there is something else embedded in the shape-up principle that applies here too: the fixed time, the variable scope. In the context of questions, this means being willing to adjust the scope of what you're trying to understand rather than stretching the time you spend chasing a question that was poorly formed to begin with. A question with an unworkable scope, too broad, too abstract, aimed at the wrong level, does not become more useful with more time spent on it.
It becomes a drain.
The discipline of scoping a question correctly before pursuing it is the same discipline as shaping a feature before building it. The shape determines whether the work is possible at all. The people who taught you things without meaning to, the mentor who asked a question that changed how you saw a problem, the friend who said, "But is that really what's bothering you?" when you were circling something and couldn't land, they were shaping before they deployed. They were doing in real time what this book has tried to lay out in a sequence. What becomes possible, on the other side of this practice, is harder to list than you'd expect. Better work is possible not because you become smarter, but because you stop spending months building in the wrong direction, and you start surfacing the problems that actually need solving rather than the ones that are most visible or most comfortable to address. The team that can ask, "What are we most wrong about right now?" and actually sit with the answer is operating at a fundamentally different level than the team that can't. Better relationships are possible not because you become a therapist or a guru, but because the people closest to you will eventually feel the difference between a question that's genuinely curious about them and a question that's looking for a particular answer.
Genuine curiosity is rare. When someone feels it, they open.
The quality of your questions is, among other things, a way of showing people how seriously you take them.
Fewer wasted months are possible.
Wasted months are almost always the product of an avoided question, the business model that was never seriously tested, the relationship pattern that was never named, the assumption at the center of a plan that everyone could feel was shaky but no one asked about directly. The question that would have surfaced, it was usually available. It just wasn't asked. That's not a failure of information. It's a failure of questioning. The two are different problems, and this practice addresses the second one. More honest conversations with yourself become possible. This is the one that's hardest to quantify and most significant in practice. The internal dialogue that runs underneath everything, the narration you give yourself about what you're doing and why and whether it's working, gets more truthful. Not more brutal. More truthful. The difference matters. Brutality is a performance. Truth is just observation without flinching. And an honest internal narrative, over time, produces better decisions than a comfortable one, not immediately, and not in ways you can always attribute directly, but consistently and cumulatively in the way that any real change in direction is eventually visible over distance. There's a sentence that I keep coming back to, from a mathematician named Rainer Maria Rilke, actually a poet, which is part of why it works, who told a young correspondent to live the questions. Not to resolve them prematurely, not to force answers before the questions have done their work. To live inside them, to be patient, and to trust that one day, without quite knowing how, you will find yourself living into the answers. That is not the same as indefinite deferral. It is not advice to ask without ever deciding, or to reflect without ever acting. It is the recognition that the questions worth carrying are the ones that, when you carry them well, change what you see and what you do and who you become, whether or not they ever produce a clean, final answer. There's a version of this practice that stays technical forever, a repertoire of frameworks and protocols that you deploy with competence. That's not a failure mode. That's genuinely useful. But the deeper version is something else, a kind of attention. A habit of noticing what's actually being asked underneath what's being asked, in conversations and decisions and in the quiet of your own thinking. That habit is not a tool you pick up and put down. It becomes part of how you move through the world. You can't unknow what a good question feels like once you've felt it. That's the part that makes this worth the effort. The person at the desk, revising the message, choosing the better question, they didn't choose it because they completed a course, or because they have a system they can name. They chose it because they've spent long enough practicing that the better question is now, more often than not, the first one that wants to be asked. This is what the book was trying to get to, all along. Not a checklist. Not a set of frameworks to apply mechanically until they lose their meaning. A shift in what surfaces first, a rewiring of the instinct, so that the question underneath the question arrives before you've already committed to the surface one. That shift doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't happen because you read something. It happens because you practiced, and kept practicing, even when it was uncomfortable, even when you weren't sure it was working, even when you could feel the pull of the old patterns and chose the better question anyway. They hit send. They go into the meeting. There will be more questions to ask there, some of them hard, some of them the kind that open a room instead of closing it. They're ready. Not because they know the answers. Because they've learned what to ask.